If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What is the one encounter with the paranormal or supernatural that turned you from a skeptic into a believer?
Whistling at night. My girlfriend and I recently moved into a new apartment in a new city and had something strange happen last night. We always stay up late on our days off and go to bed about 2 to 3 a.m. Last night we lay down after watching a movie and were beginning to go to sleep. I was in that part of sleep where you're sort of awake and sort of asleep, so it's hard to tell what's going on, and I heard a whistle come from my living room. It was the kind of whistle someone does when they are trying to get someone's attention. Phew hoo. I opened my eyes and looked around and didn't see anything, but it scared me because it was so real. I knew my girlfriend was probably still awake, so I said, "Did you hear that?" And she instantly responded, "Hear what?" So I assumed it was just me hearing stuff because I was falling asleep and that happens to me all the time, so I went back to bed. This morning when we were getting in the car, my girlfriend said, "Hey, I didn't want to scare you last night, but I heard that whistle too. It feels like someone is watching me when I go to sleep, and I find myself looking out into the living room often at night trying to see if someone is there. My cats have been meowing excessively at night, specifically when we are going to bed, which is unusual for them. I've had very few paranormal experiences in my life, so I'm kind of a skeptic and not sure what I believe. My girlfriend said she's been hearing stuff at night when I'm at work and that the chairs in the kitchen have been in different spots than she left them multiple times. Any insight would be helpful, thanks." The woman at the gate. A while ago, I was a young and foolish hardcore atheist type who would take the piss out of anyone talking about ghosts or aliens or anything out there. My worldview was extremely narrow, and I didn't have much interest in anything outside of going to the pub with my mates. I want to share with you guys the experience that forced me to completely 180 from that old, annoying character into someone who fully believes. No, not believes, knows the existence of the spirit world. I was living with an ex-girlfriend, and on her street was a big house on the corner. The property was surrounded by a high fence, but there was a little gate in the middle where you could get a glimpse of the well-kept garden. An old woman lived alone there and could often be seen pottering around in her garden, though most of her time outdoors would be spent behind the little gate between the fences. We'd see her there all the time, chatting with neighbors or just having a nosy up the street. I never really spoke to her myself, but I saw her there a lot. One night, at around 10:30 p.m., I was pulling up on the street outside my girlfriend's house after going to see my mate. It was dark. I had literally nothing on my mind and wasn't thinking about anything. I parked the car and proceeded to get out the door. The house on the corner with the gate was just in front of my parking spot. As I close my car door and start to lock it, I notice a bright light coming from the gate. I look and see a full apparition of this old woman. It was her, but it was like a foggy, translucent figure of her giving off a pretty big amount of white light. The fence was even illuminated by the light she was radiating. She turned and looked at me, and as soon as we faced each other, she shifted behind the fence. It wasn't like someone stepping aside, it was like she drifted sideways as if floating. Being who I was instantly trying to dismiss it, convincing myself I'd imagined it. I went into my girlfriend's house and said, "You are gonna think I'm crazy, but I'm sure I just saw a ghost or something at that old woman's house." My girlfriend replied, "You do know she died 2 days ago, don't you?" I froze. Her words were horrifying because they confirmed what I saw. I started freaking out. Kind of funny now I look back, I remember my eyes were just streaming, and I was in shock. I kept replaying what I'd just seen over and over in my mind. It hit me like a truck. I needed that experience badly. It changed me and led me on a whole journey of, well, if ghosts are real, what else is there? And I've since discovered a ton about this strange realm that I would have never learned if not for that experience. I don't care if no one believes me. Without witnessing it, I wouldn't have believed it either. We can entertain ghost stories or even choose to believe them, but you can't know them until you've seen them yourself. My whole life, I have dealt with the paranormal, but this one incident has haunted me my entire life. It has been the hard evidence that I needed to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. That my experiences weren't some dream or hallucination of some sort. The spirit realm is real. When I was 8, I woke up and started my morning like any other day. My mom had me get my clothes ready for the day while she started my bath. I tossed my clothes on my bed and sat on the floor, still sleepy. I loved to sleep in a big t-shirt and undies as a kid, so I looked down at my bare legs, and there were 3 different handprints on my little thighs. They each had 4 long fingers. I'm an artist, and I know the way that our human bodies are precisely proportioned. If you measure the length of your middle finger, it will be the same length as your palm. These fingers were twice as long as the palm. I had one on one thigh, the biggest handprint, and 2 on the other, one medium size and one small, and all I could do was stare at them with a feeling of dread. I was used to being bothered by spirits, and I was tired of it. My mom told me it was time to get in the tub, so I did as I was told. The water was still low in the tub, and my mom had left it on to continue filling it up. I submerged my body in the water, but it wasn't high enough to cover my legs just yet. I sat quietly and tried to remove the handprint somehow. It wasn't like a bruise or red mark. It was white as if the hands were pressing down on my legs. I didn't feel right either. The water kept rising. Kept rising until it reached the handprints. I expected it to wash them away, but it didn't. The water covered my thighs except for where the handprints were. I screamed for my mom, and she ran in. She watched as the handprints quickly covered over with water and turned to bubbles. I frantically wiped the bubbles away, and the handprints were finally gone. My mom ran off crying to call our pastor, and I just sat there relieved that she saw them and scared for the nights ahead. According to my mom, it wasn't the first time it had happened. She said I told her some days earlier that I woke up with my legs covered in similar but much smaller handprints, but she didn't believe me and sent me off to school. I remember going to the bathroom in the middle of class to check if they were still there, and they were gone. I just can't wrap my head around how the handprints in the tub reacted. I'm into the paranormal, and I want to become a paranormal investigator, but I'm skeptical at all times, even though I'm religious. But not being able to explain that experience away has made it hard for me to find comfort at night for 30 years. My skeptic friend had a paranormal encounter. So today he was coming to meet me after my late night shift ended since I needed to give him something, and we were meeting at the train station. It's super dark, and this is an old, small village with no streetlights at all apart from some surrounding the train station. He got there before me and headed down this arched bridge tunnel where it was pitch black to pee in the bushes, lol. From where he was standing, he was down a small hill and could see the train station and some of its light and the bicycle shelter just outside it. He says he glanced up to make sure no one was around and saw a man frozen in a mid-running stance near the bicycle shelter and looked away for a second. He realized then the man's face looked too white and quickly looked back, but he was gone. Needless to say, he was absolutely freaked out. When I got there, he just kept saying he couldn't believe he had seen that, but he's convinced it wasn't a light trick. I'm really interested in the paranormal and the occult, so he was asking me some questions about spirits, which is fun for me because he was skeptical of all that stuff a few hours ago. This could just be a coincidence, but when he was waiting for the train with me, he was Googling any deaths that had happened near the train station and found quite a few suicides as well as a man who was reported as a sudden death and nothing more 2 months ago tomorrow. I thought that was interesting because of the way he described the man being frozen and the idea that spirits are lost because of sudden and tragic deaths. I saw my grandmother as a shadow figure in the middle of the night, and that is now why I believe in the paranormal afterlife. This took place about 16 years ago in my home at the time. I was approximately 11 years old. I knew my grandmother wasn't doing well on my father's side of the family. My mom having full custody of me and my father having weekend visitations, I unfortunately did not have much of a relationship with my grandmother, and my final memories are of seeing her in a nursing home. Her communication method of pen and paper is due to having a trachea and not being able to verbally communicate. Being told she was not doing well and that these were her final days. To the best of my memory, I do not recall being discussed with about her passing or attending a funeral. As I look back now, all I recall is one day not visiting her anymore. Now on to the paranormal part of the story and why I'm a believer of the afterlife today. One night, I was later told it was the week after her passing, I was sleeping in my mom's room. Not sure why I chose her room instead of my own for the night. Anyhow, I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. In the corner of the room, about 5 feet from the end of the bed, I see a shadow of an outlined human being. This shadow had no detailed features. Just a black mass. How did I know it was my grandmother then? The hand of the shadow was to its face, resting its chin against its thumb. It's challenging to recall my full reaction. I was startled, scared at the least. I've never experienced anything like this. My mom was woken up, the bed lamp turned on, and within seconds it was gone. After describing what I had seen to my mom, she truly believes this was the spirit of my grandmother watching over us and saying her final goodbyes before passing on. It was told to me that the posture of what I described is how she used to stand and would do all the time. Sure, maybe this could be classified as a dream, and me recalling more details of her presence before she passed than I remember and turning it into my own creation. But I truly don't recall ever seeing her in that posture and position. I consider myself a skeptic until given a reason to believe. Well, here it is. I believe in the afterlife and the paranormal. Something happens. Even if it's for just a short period of time. I've never experienced anything visually like this again after that day, besides one other day of feeling a presence and being hit with emotions of my other grandmother years later when I was in college. Coincidence shortly after her passing. I've visited her grave. Spoken to her. Asked her if she is who and what I saw that one night. Not much has come from those actions, but I still carry the thought with me from day to day. This has definitely left me searching and wondering more about what the paranormal afterlife can bring. Now that I have grown to the mindset of not being scared and more intrigued and curious about what's possible and any explanations that can be given of occurrences. The day I became a believer. This isn't my first encounter in my life, but it definitely was the most convincing. I was in Okinawa for a few months, and one day some friends and I decided to go see Shuri Castle. It had burned down a while ago, so there wasn't much to see anymore. While wandering around, we came across these steps that lead down to a pond. So, we headed down to check it out when I noticed this path over to the left. I decided to follow it because, why not? And I noticed this hole or old entry into a room of some sort. It was barred up, so you couldn't walk in it, but while I was looking, I noticed this dark mass. The room itself was already dark, but this mass was noticeably darker. I could also feel a powerful energy coming from it. After trying to figure out what it was for a few seconds, I called my friend over to see if he noticed it too. He said he couldn't see anything, but when I tried to point it out, it rushed me. At this point, I get chills throughout my entire body, and I begin feeling extremely sad, like I'm about to cry. My buddy noticed this change in me, and we honestly started laughing about the situation since it was kind of crazy. We end up walking away and continuing down the main path toward the pond. I couldn't shake the feeling whatever I just encountered gave me, so on our way back, I decided to take another look, but this time it rushed me instantly. I turned around and went back to the main path, but whatever it was stayed with me. I began feeling like my energy was leaving my body, to the point that I had to sit in the middle of the path. I kept telling it to go away, that it wasn't allowed to follow me, but it definitely didn't listen. The rest of the day we spent in Naha, I just couldn't shake this thing. Even when we got back to where we were staying, all night I could feel it watching me while I was trying to sleep. I asked my friend's wife, who was a local, to see if I could get a cleansing anywhere, and thankfully she was able to help me out. It was just a freaky situation, and the energy that it gave off was extremely powerful. I have never felt something like that before, and I hope to not encounter anything like it again. I have never believed in ghosts or spirits, but now I will forever. About 6 months ago, a group of friends of mine came to my parents' house for my birthday for a few days. This was right after our college semester had just ended. One night we decided to hang out at the pool in my neighborhood. I live in a gated community, and there is a community pool in there, and it was very late at night, just around 2 to 3 a.m. Over the course of the time that we were there, I began to notice shadows moving around in my peripheral vision and, at times, the sound of footsteps running behind me. I live in Florida, so I assumed it was just iguanas or some other sort of wildlife that might be around. However, within an hour or so, I continued seeing shadows and hearing strange noises around me. They would be gone just as quickly as I would notice them. Eventually, I mentioned to one of my friends with me that I was seeing and hearing things and thought I was going crazy. He said, "Dude, you aren't crazy because I've been seeing and hearing stuff too, I just didn't want to say anything." I asked the rest of my friends, and some of them didn't notice anything, but others had sworn they saw shadows moving in the distance. All of us described the same sort of eerie feeling as well. It seemed as though we weren't alone in the place. But we were. It was late at night, and we had been there alone for hours. Then one of my friends spoke up, and he had told me that he talked to my dad earlier and that my dad had recently found out that our neighborhood was built on an ancient Native American burial ground. My parents had moved to this neighborhood while I've been in college, so this was news to me. Also, I'm personally not religious at all and don't really believe in paranormal activity. I have never believed in ghosts and certainly never thought I'd seen a spirit. I could have sworn I was seeing things. Sure enough, I looked up the history of my neighborhood location, and hundreds of human remains were found in a sacred burial mound on the land. It was discovered in the early 1900s, just thought to be a mound of sand. After remains were discovered, the land was bought by an archaeological enthusiast who eventually turned the mound into an amusement park where people could walk through a tunnel and view the remains of Native Americans from around 800 years ago. There were even tigers and lions on the land too, with dozens of exotic animals that were attractions in the amusement park. Eventually this park fell out, and in the 80s, it was expected to be purchased by the county as a historical preservation. However, it was bought out by the current owners of my gated community that exists today. There are dozens of condos and houses built all over the land, And the actual mound is still there today, covered with grass and trees. To this day, I still get the same eerie feeling when I pass by that mound in my neighborhood because I always thought it was just a man-made hill for decoration. But it's not, and guess where it is? Right next to the pool. I told someone I saw a ghost, and when I described what I saw, the person knew them. This happened many years ago, but I can clearly recollect this story. It is very much a true story. About 15 or so years ago, I had made a new friend, Kara, and I was at their sister, Anna's flat. Anna's flatmate, Tina, was home, so there were 4 of us sitting around having coffee and chatting. I needed to use the loo and was directed there. The bathroom was huge, with a clawfoot bath in one corner. The loo was diagonally opposite the bath. While I was on the loo, I saw out of the corner of my eye a young woman of similar age to me sitting in the bathtub, and I almost jumped up off the loo mid-pee. When I looked back at the bathtub, she wasn't there. I had many experiences with spirits, so I didn't find this strange. It was just the initial moment when she appeared that I got a bit of a fright. I got up and went to wash my hands and saw her out of the corner of my eye again, so I kept not looking directly at her and was able to see a bit more of what she looked like. She was smiling the whole time and pointing out towards the lounge. I knew that she wanted me to tell the others that she was there. This is sometimes part of my experience. It's like the spirit is in my mind, and I can sense what they are trying to communicate. I hesitated about saying something because I barely knew my new friend and had only just met the sister and flatmate. I went out and sat for a minute before I said, this might sound odd, but do any of you believe in ghosts? My friend and her sister were skeptical, but Tina, the flatmate, said, why is that? And so I explained that I sometimes see things/experience things and describe the person I saw. As I spoke, Tina seemed really interested/in disbelief. She asked me to pause and went and got a photo album. She handed it to me and asked me to look through it and tell her if I saw her. I looked through and pointed to one photo and said, her face looks like this person, but her hair is different, it is more like this, pointing to a different girl in another photo. Tina slowly said, the person you pointed to and said, her face is like this, is a friend of mine. She died in a freak accident a few months ago. A few days before she died, she had gotten a new haircut, just like the other girl who you said her hair was like. She loved that haircut. When Tina said that, all the hair stood up on my arms. This incident is one of about 3 or 4 in which I have been able to corroborate what I saw with someone who I do not know and who did not know me, so there was no way we had this info prior. And they happened before we all had social media and saw photos of people our friends knew online. Anyhow, I just thought I'd share. This spirit was a really lovely, bubbly presence. I still remember how vibrant her personality felt. This happened when I was 7 or 8 years old. I was in the living room playing while my family was in the kitchen having dinner. My house has a 12-step staircase that connects the first floor with the second. If you are in the living room, as I was that day, you can see the full staircase. At some point, while playing, I looked at the upper steps, and I saw a white figure going upstairs. I just saw the legs. It was completely white. I remember thinking to myself, isn't my whole family in the kitchen? And so I went to the kitchen, saw my whole family there, and I told my parents that I had seen someone dressed in white going upstairs. I still remember how worried they were when they heard my words. Naturally, they went upstairs to check right away. Quietly, thinking that it may be an intruder, they went upstairs and checked every single room and corner of the house. There was nobody but us. So, what was it that I saw? Like many of you, I believe in science. I have a degree, and I know how to conduct scientific research in my area. However, there are many things that science has not dealt with yet. And I still wonder, after all these years, what was that thing that I clearly saw going upstairs? It's almost midnight here in my country, and as I'm writing this, I am not going to lie, I got a bit scared remembering what happened that day. The amusing thing is that I did not get scared one bit when I was a little boy, and I even remember feeling proud about it. You see, my family is very religious, although they never go to church, and they always told me the usual religious association of white/light equals good and black/dark equals evil. And since the figure I saw was completely white, I thought it was a good spirit. Now, again, what was it? My rational mind tells me that there must be a reasonable explanation. Did I simply imagine it? Was it some sort of visual effect? And I questioned myself, why would a ghost go upstairs with his legs and not just fly or get through things? But it was so vivid. And it lasted at least 2 seconds. Have you ever experienced something similar? A man named Mr. Jacobs used to live 2 houses down from my childhood home when I was growing up until the age of 12 when my family moved. I'm in college now, And in the summer of 2012, I went to visit my hometown and family. I haven't been back to my hometown in 10 years. One night I was on a walk after a hot, sleepless night, and I had taken my cousin's dog Bud with me. I wanted to visit my childhood home and decided to walk to it at night. It was like 9 p.m., and the sun was just setting. Stupid. I know. But I grew up in a small town of about 3,000 folks only, and I had to walk across town to my old neighborhood. My cousin lives in some newer homes that were recently built in a new part of town. It took me like 30 minutes. As I was walking towards my house, I saw Mr. Jacobs just standing outside on the porch of his house in the dark. How I remember, I have no clue, but I just knew it was him. So I waved to him and said, "Hi, Mr. Jacobs. How are you doing?" He just looked at me and nodded his head at me and just stood there. I didn't think much, but Bud was whimpering and barking at Mr. Jacobs like crazy. I just kept walking and tried to calm Bud down. I saw my childhood home, but now some other family was living in it. Stared at it for a few minutes and turned right back around. When I was walking back, I didn't even notice if Mr. Jacobs was there but went on my way back to my cousin's house. The next morning, my cousin asked me where I had gone out last night. I just told him that I walked to the old house, and he said to me, "Did you see Mr. Jacobs?" I excitedly responded, "Yes, I did, as a matter of fact." He then went on to proceed to tell me that I might just have seen a ghost because Mr. Jacobs was shot in front of his house in 2008 and died, and the house has been empty since. I thought my cousin was trying to prank me or just messing with me, but then his wife walked out of the kitchen and said, "Mr. Jacobs died a while ago, you just saw a ghost. A lot of people in town have been seeing him there." I guess that's when I sorta became a believer and definitely not a skeptic. Went to some haunted abandoned place with my one buddy and his girl, didn't see anything, of course, like I said, right? Went back to my house that night. About 2 hours later, those two ripped into my driveway like they were shot out of a cannon. Naturally, I flew out there myself because I knew something was up. We were standing in my gravel walkway to my front porch, and I have a storm door, and it was a nice fall night, so naturally the front door was open so you could get into my house through the storm door. They explained they were seeing a shadow person in their house. Right as they finished, I looked over at his girl, and she was white as a ghost. My big German Shepherd was outside with us, and he whipped around to face the door right about the same time she turned pale. His hair stood up, ears laid back, head down, teeth bared, growling. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a shadow person standing in my house. Now if this person darts to the left, I'd see it in the living room window, and if it goes right, there are only 3 rooms it could have gone. It went left. I yelled to them to stay put. I ran up the porch, my dog was right on my heels. I went right to my bedroom, grabbed my pistol, chambered around, and went back in the direction it went. My dog went left towards where it went. Searched my house for probably 20 minutes and found nothing. Heard my buddy's girl scream out front. My dog and I both bolted back to the front door having heard that. My porch is about 5 feet off the ground, and I honestly don't think I touched a step on it on my way back out. After I hit the ground, I looked up, and that same shadow figure was lurking just outside the range of my front porch light, moving closer to them. Almost circling to the side like a shark. My dog and I both ran right past my buddy and his girl, and my dog stood just in front of me, and we were just a couple feet from my friends. When this thing saw my dog and me coming, it began to retreat, and it backed up to the road. I pulled up my pistol and began shifting to my right to get a good angle for a shot so I don't shoot straight at my neighbor's house. My dog was sidestepping, matching me step for step, staying in front of me. Just as I'm starting to squeeze the trigger, I see headlights coming from the top of the hill, so naturally I back off the trigger, and when the light hit this thing, it disappeared. I couldn't believe it. Never saw it again, and neither did they. Rattled me pretty good. When I was a child, I never really watched scary movies or anything. Being a nerd, I spent my childhood watching cartoons and the Weather Channel. One night my little sister started screaming bloody murder in her room. My mom and my aunt, who was over for the night, barged into the room and then closed the door really fast, and I could just hear mumbled talking and my sister crying. Me being the nosy kid I was, I stood outside the door and just heard them say, "It's okay, they're gone now, it's okay," over and over again. When they finally opened the door, the TV was on, and my sister was watching Pooh Bear. I asked what happened, and they said to just go to bed, but they were pale white. My mom ended up sleeping in my little sister's room that night. Fast forward a few years, this all occurred when I was about 8 and sis was about 6, and they finally told me what happened. Apparently while my sister was lying in bed about to fall asleep, she started seeing people with scary faces dancing around on her walls. Almost like puppets. And they were staring at her. She screamed, and when my mom opened the door, she and my aunt caught like a 5-second glimpse of it, and then the night light went out, and they turned the lights on, and they were gone. The reason my mom slept in there that night is to pray over my sister and show the spirits they can't win and they aren't welcome. Terrifying. I had some really crazy experiences in my room after that, but I mostly kept them to myself so I didn't scare anyone else. I can't stop thinking about it. Made me 100% a believer. This happened a little over a year ago. I was staying at an Airbnb in Pennsylvania with my family. It was really nice. I have 3 sisters and a brother and a mom and dad. My older sister, brother, and I were taking the bedrooms in the basement. My sister and I are sharing. It was a finished basement, not creepy or anything. It was nice. My parents were on the main floor. And my 2 little sisters upstairs. The first night I couldn't sleep. I had a dream. I kept waking up at the same time, 2:12 a.m., and a woman in a white dress with long, messy black hair ran at me with a lamp. I would wake up crying and screaming, and it would happen again and again. I was stuck. I finally woke up crying hysterically and woke up my sister. The next morning at breakfast, my brother was in a miserable mood. We're all sitting at the table, and my mom asked what's wrong, why are we cranky? And he said he had a bad dream where this creepy woman kept attacking him. Edit. I added the next part below. My older sister thought we were somehow messing with her. My mom got mad and said not to scare my little sisters and said there's no such thing as ghosts, but then the door to the basement slammed shut. It was in the middle of the house, with no windows open, no air. My mom said it was just a coincidence, but we were spooked. Then during the day we went out and came home to the front door open. All the doors all around the house were open. All drawers and cabinets, too. My dad called the cops, and they searched the whole house because we thought someone broke in. But nobody was there. That night my older sister woke me up sobbing. She was begging me to make it stop and please tell her that I'm real. She had the same dream. We were freaked, and the next night we all slept in my brother's room. 3 full-grown adults. We're in our 20s. Terrified. My parents were annoyed and said we were being ridiculous. I was joking around with my siblings and said I would talk to the ghost and was saying stuff like, "Hey ghosty, you seem to be confused. If you want anything done, you gotta ask my mom." That night around 3 a.m. we heard screaming. My mom was freaking out upstairs. She was yelling at my dad about messing with her and that it wasn't funny, but he had no idea what she was talking about. Whatever it was genuinely freaked her out. She made us leave that morning. We had 4 days left on our Airbnb with no refund and got last-minute plane tickets because she wouldn't stay a day longer in that house. I still have no idea what she saw or experienced, but my siblings always say I 100% did that by messing with it. I know it sounds so ridiculous, but I swear it's true. And I would love it if people would maybe help explain or anything similar that happened to them. I know it sounds insane, but I know what we experienced. When I was a child, I saw something that someone else later in life also saw. I felt like I was being watched for 13 years. I'm very skeptical when it comes to believing in spirits or paranormal activity. I take stories that people tell me with a grain of salt and think they've either made it up or in their own minds have themselves convinced it actually happened. I think that's exactly what I did. What I'm about to discuss started happening from a young age and occurred until I was around 18. I would like to say I don't believe it actually happened, but the creepiness of it and how it made me feel for those 13 years has stuck with me, so I would like to at least discuss it and theorize with people. It's pretty vanilla, but how it made me feel was definitely not vanilla. 1996, age 5. My mom always read me a bedtime story when she put me to bed, and I always fell asleep. This particular night I didn't fall asleep, and she stayed with me for a while longer until she fell asleep herself and I was still awake. I was kind of bored and just looking around the room. I looked up at the window position behind my bed, and even though the blinds were closed, I was able to see through the cracks in the turned down blinds. I immediately saw 2 reddish eyes looking in. I thought they were eyes because I kept looking for a while. They were moving around a little like they weren't completely stationary, and then appeared to blink. I immediately turned over and woke up my mom. She said it was just a dream and to go back to sleep, but to this day I swear I had never slept and was awake. My bedroom window is above our balcony, but you would have to be really tall or on a ladder to see into my window from it. I don't have any siblings, and my dad was asleep when this happened. Not long after that, I did have a nightmare about what I saw. I dreamed that it was a wolf-like animal, and my dad was fighting it in the hallway to our bedrooms. I woke up and immediately knew it was a dream, but to this day I still don't think what I initially saw was one. I developed a deep fear of the dark because of this. 2007, age 16. From 1996 to 2007, I had never seen any occurrence like what I saw that first night, but I switched to turning my blinds upwards so I couldn't see outside. For some reason, even before the nightmare, I had decided it was a wolf-like animal, not sure why. I still had a deep fear of the dark. Since it happened, I would intermittently feel like something was watching me, or I wasn't alone. Sometimes it felt like an unfriendly presence, and other times it felt comforting, like something was protecting me. I once went a year without getting the feeling, and it hit me when I was driving home from a friend's house in the middle of the day. The drive from my friend's house home was about 20 minutes of rocky barrens with patches of forest. An unfriendly presence hit me so hard that I pulled over, checked the car, and got out of the car. I climbed up a small cliff next to the roadside to look out over the barrens, but there wasn't anything there. I got back in the car and continued driving. I visited this friend a lot, and I started to find that feeling would hit me at the exact same spot in those barrens, day or night, but only in the night around my parents' house. This same friend slept over one night. We went out on my deck so she could have a cigarette, and I got the feeling of an unfriendly presence. At this point in life I was screaming at myself that I was being irrational. There was nothing there, I didn't see a wolf-like creature, I just thought I saw it. As I was thinking this, I realized my friend was looking out into the small patch of forest behind my house squinting. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she could swear she saw something watching us and moving around, like a dog but a lot bigger. At this point I was shitting my pants and coaxed her inside. I had never told her about this story, so she would have never known about my speculations. 2009, age 18. Still haven't seen any evidence myself since I was 5, only my friend's observation, which aligned with what I think I saw as a kid. I still felt like something was intermittently watching me, both at home, on the drive to that same friend's house, and even around where she lived. I started dating someone that lived not too far from her, so we all hung out a lot. At this point I'm still scared of the dark. Sometimes I could walk down a trail by myself and would be completely fine, other times I was crippled with fear and ran or had someone lead me. One time camping, I felt the presence so bad that I had to get my boyfriend to lead me to our tent while I shut my eyes and covered my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every noise scared the shit out of me, and it didn't help that other people were around. I remember driving home the next day, and I did feel like something was watching me, but this was one of those times that it felt comforting, more comforting than it had ever felt before. 2010, age 19. Driving over to see the same boyfriend, I realized I hadn't felt that feeling like something was watching in a long time, probably since I had that last comforting feeling. I drove through the barrens almost every day without that feeling popping up. It was gone just like that. I moved away from my hometown soon after. Present day, age 33. No more sightings, no more feelings like something is watching. My crippling fear of the dark went away, and even though the dark still makes me feel uneasy, I prefer to go for runs at night. I've lived back home for a while but mainly lived in the city and have since moved out of the province entirely. To this day it's never returned and appears to have just stopped abruptly, but it's probably the thing that stuck with me most over the years since I was a kid. I used to be a skeptic, but now I'm not so sure. There have been a few strange happenings in my life in the last 24 hours, and I feel like there's a lot of background info needed for it to make sense. To begin, both of my parents are dead. I'm 24 and female now, but my mom passed when I was 15, and my dad just 9 months later when I was 16. Mom passed in a car accident, and dad ended himself. My dad was a firefighter for most of his life, and both parents struggled with addiction. I'm not sure how relevant that is, but just so you have all of the info. So here's where it really starts. I was standing in the corner of my kitchen this morning, huge open floor plan, so my back was to the rest of the apartment. I was making myself some breakfast when I heard what is distinctly a man take in a deep breath and sigh. It sounded like it was right behind me, and I spun around. Obviously, nothing is there. It's early morning, my cats were sleeping upstairs and wouldn't be able to make that noise regardless. No electronics were on at all because my roommate and I unplugged them last night due to a lot of thunderstorms in our city. My roommate was asleep, and he sleeps with tape over his mouth. Don't ask, he's a mouth breather, so he couldn't have made that noise, not to mention that his room is on the other side of the kitchen, not behind me. I genuinely have no idea what could have made that noise other than some kind of entity. After that, I finish getting ready and go to work. I tell my coworkers what happened, and I start to kind of piece together some other things that have been going on lately and connect them. For example, last night at work I got 2 phone calls within 5 minutes of each other, and both of them just said goodbye in a man's voice and hung up. My roommate also left a candle burning in our shared bathroom overnight, and my dad, the firefighter, spent my whole life drilling fire safety into my head lol. Yesterday I was going through a bunch of my things and spring cleaning essentially and ended up finding a few of my dad's things that I've never seen before, even though I've gone through his things dozens of times in the almost 8 years he's been gone. I found a very cryptic note with things written on it like despair, pain, loneliness, darkness, etc., and at the bottom, my name was written and circled. I also found a cassette recorder with my dad's voice on it. I've been getting splitting headaches for the last 2 days when I normally don't get them at all. The noise itself sounded like it came from the corner directly behind me, and the only things there are a wax warmer and one of my dad's old bottles from his house, which has its own very creepy backstory. And lastly, to get to my apartment, you have to walk up a stairwell that has motion sensor lights. For the past couple of days, the light has been flickering nonstop, so all of that by itself, while still very alarming, could be kind of ignored. But then I get home from work today, open the door to the stairwell, and the light is still flickering. Until I am standing directly below it. As soon as I get underneath it, it stops flickering and is working normally. I stood there for almost a full minute and took a video of it to show to my roommate. The second I turned around to keep going up the stairs, it started to flicker again. I really don't know what to make of all of this or where to go from here, so any advice or thoughts at all would be greatly appreciated. My skeptic mom saw a ghost. So, my mom was staying with me one summer, and we had some unexplainable things happen. I wasn't surprised by this, but my mom was annoyed by it and proceeded to tell me that the places I live in aren't haunted. That I'm the one that's haunted. I asked her to explain what that meant, and she started with this. In the spring of 1985, while pregnant with me, my parents were living in Nebraska. My mother worked nights and would sleep during the day until my dad got home from work. One day, while snoozing, she heard the front door open and shut. She called out to my dad, "Honey, is that you?" There was no reply, except for boots clopping across the floor. Then the record player started playing. She called out to my dad again, "Honey? What are you doing?" Again, no reply, except bootsteps. She lay there, not sure why my dad was acting so strangely. She started to get out of bed when this man walked into her room, who was not my dad. She said he was dressed in a black leather jacket and jeans, a handkerchief tied on his head, and biker's boots. He was big. And he was non-corporeal. She was most unnerved by the fact that he just walked through the wall. He stared at her for a minute or so, then turned and walked away. She heard the record player stop and the door open and close, and he was just gone. She told me that that was her first experience with a ghost and that she had always believed that it had something to do with me. Super comforting, Ma. In college, broke into an old state hospital that had been used since World War I but had been shut down because of asbestos. No power and no people in this place, with a 15-foot fence surrounding the property. We'd heard stories about the place. Mainly from the people that lived around it. We decided to check it out one Saturday night. Bolt cutters made getting through the fence pretty easy. Getting into the hospital required breaking a window on a lower floor and boosting each other up. We wandered around for about an hour inside, bullshitting and just walking. Then we hit cold spots. I mean really cold. We could see our breath. We found this odd considering that it was in the upper 60s outside. Then the noises started. Distant voices that you couldn't quite make out, seeing things just at the edge of the flashlight beam, sounds of footsteps other than our own. Shit like that. I was the first to decide I was no longer curious and got the duck out of there as quickly as I could. Nobody argued to the contrary, and we all left at the same time. For those who are curious, this hospital is located in Little Rock. The door. I lived in the Appalachian Mountains my whole life, where the woods are thick, tangled, and full of mystery. Growing up there felt like stepping back in time. We had no cell phones or gadgets to distract us. Just the endless expanse of forest as our playground and our imaginations as our guide. My best friend Madison and I would spend hours exploring the dense woods behind my house, following animal tracks, climbing trees, and discovering hidden creeks. In autumn, when the leaves turned fiery shades and fell, revealing clearer paths, we'd push a little deeper each day. We'd mark our bases in the most secret nooks we stumbled upon, pretending we were the first explorers to find them. But no matter how brave we felt, we always stayed close enough to see my house in the distance. Until one day, when the forest felt just a little more inviting, a little less ordinary, and curiosity got the better of us. We brought twine, and other supplies, that day, winding it around tree trunks so we'd find our way back. We kept walking, deeper than we'd ever gone before, until we reached a strange old tree that split in two, like a giant slingshot rising from the ground. Right next to it, half hidden in the hillside beneath a pile of leaves and branches, was a rusty handle. As we brushed away the leaves, we realized it was attached to a heavy, wooden door, embedded in the earth as if it had always been there, waiting. Heart pounding, Madison and I both tugged on the handle, and the door finally broke open, revealing steps leading down into pitch blackness. Madison looked at me, unsure, but we felt compelled to go down. Maybe it was the mystery or the thrill of finding something forgotten, but we didn't hesitate. The air was thick and damp as we descended. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped room. In the middle of the floor lay a single, worn photograph. I held it up to our flashlight and froze. It showed 2 children, both girls, standing in front of a house that looked eerily like mine. The girls' eyes were so dark, and their grins twisted, a little too wide. Madison and I looked at each other, panicked, and then bolted back up the steps, leaving the photo behind us. When we reached the top, we looked around. Our path of twine was gone, as if someone, or something, had unraveled it. We blindly ran back through the forest, finally reaching my house. We burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed. My parents immediately noticed something was wrong. We tried to explain what we'd found. The strange door in the hillside, the steps, and the photograph. My mom's face tightened with concern, but my dad, always the skeptic, shook his head and laughed. But when he saw we were serious, they agreed to come with us, though I could tell they thought it was just a kid's overactive imagination. With my parents in tow, we spent what felt like hours retracing our steps through the woods, following what we remembered of the path. We finally spotted the twisted, slingshot-shaped tree standing exactly where we'd found it before. My heart leapt. But when we scoured the area around it, there was no sign of the door. No rusty handle, no disturbed leaves. Just bare earth and untouched forest floor. It was like the whole thing had never existed. My dad muttered something about kids and their stories, but as we walked back home, I caught a worried look in my mom's eyes. Madison and I exchanged a glance too, and in that moment, we knew we'd experienced something no one else would ever believe. Even now, 15 years later, Madison and I can't shake the memory of that day. We've gone back to those woods more than once, trying to find any trace of that hidden door, but it's as if it never existed. We have no explanation for what we saw, no way to make sense of it. Every time I visit home and glance up at the woods, a chill creeps up my spine, and I almost expect to see the door waiting there, half buried and forgotten, just as we left it. And no matter how hard I try, I can still see that eerie photo in my mind. The eyes, the strange grin, like it's burned into my memory. I don't feel safe anymore, and I'm getting desperate. I would generally consider myself a skeptic. I don't really believe in this kind of stuff usually, but I've been having some strange experiences. I don't have anything else to turn to, so I hope this might get me some answers, or at the very least rule out some options. Okay, so where do I even begin with this? It started back a few months ago. My house is small and only has 3 tiny bedrooms. The majority of the time I've lived here, there were 5 people here. I shared a room with my sister up until October of 2023, when my brother moved out and she took his old room. A while after that is when I started to notice odd things. At first it was generally paranoia. In my room, and only in my room, for at least an hour before I go to sleep, I get really paranoid. It could be a feeling of being watched or being hyper-aware of noise, but I would be really anxious. Then things picked up a bit. I started to feel something hovering over my ear. Never seeing anything but feeling it deeply. That tickle when someone whispers, you know? Like that. Just hovering over my ear. This only happens to my right ear. It just so happens that when I lay on my left side, I face a mirror as it's my closet door. Apparently that's bad luck. I hear? Anyway, it goes on from here. One night as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a man clearly whisper, "Stay awake," in my right ear, which scared the shit out of me for obvious reasons. And I felt that same hovering and watched feeling. Lately I've noticed things moving across my vision. Shadows in the corner of my eyes and little white blurs across my vision. This only really happens in my bedroom and not much else. I've noticed something worse when I'm asleep. I often sleep with my hand under my pillow. Sometimes my hand peeks out from under the pillow, and then it happens. Something is grabbing my hand. It starts at my index finger and pulls slightly on it as if trying to be discreet. Then it works its way to my pinky. Then it goes back to the index finger, only this time it makes small circular motions with it while pressing it on my pillow lightly. It does this with each one until it reaches my pinky. Then after that, it shakes my headboard. I've also noticed my mattress shake slightly while I sleep, which is definitely not normal. As far as I can recall, this is all the detail I have as of now. I'm worried I have a ghost of some kind. I'm also worried because mental illness runs in my family, and my grandpa had schizophrenia. So, people, I ask you, do I have a ghost, or should I be evaluated instead? And if I do have a ghost, what can I do about it? I'll try to answer as many responses as possible, so feel free to ask for any clarification in the comments. What my father saw made me a believer in the paranormal. My father is a policeman. He is a straightforward individual who firmly focuses on the present moment and relies solely on his own senses. At the time of this story, he had been serving in the police force for more than 20 years, and I was a teenager. My father worked night shifts, and on a regular basis he would come home in the early morning to have breakfast with us before he would go to bed and we would go to school. He would usually be in a positive mood and tell us funny or intriguing stories from his day, or night, at work. This morning he was unusually silent, and he didn't eat either. My mother asked if he felt alright. It took him some time to respond, and he said, "I'm not sure what I experienced tonight." He didn't want to say any more in front of us kids, but we prodded him long enough until he told us the following. It had been a quiet night, and he was out with his colleague in a police car. At some point they were informed over the radio that a car chase was going on not far from them and their assistance was required. They drove off towards the chase and soon caught up with the suspect's vehicle. The radio had informed them that 2 men were in the front of the car. My father's car pulled up almost beside the car so that he managed to get a good look inside. He saw the 2 men in the front arguing heatedly with each other. And he saw another man in the back. He had no hair and was so pale that he seemed almost white. He was dressed all in black. And he looked directly at my father, his face almost pressed against the window, with very dark eyes, and he grinned widely. My father was deeply unsettled by this person. He seemed to look directly into my father's eyes. My father was so sure of this third person that he informed the other police cars about him. The chase ended with the car crashing into a fence and the suspects fleeing into a field. They were apprehended only minutes later. There were 2 men. Not 3. My father asked all his colleagues at the scene if they were sure there hadn't been another guy. Nobody else had seen the third man. "I can't explain it," he said to us. "I saw him clearly, and he smiled at me as if he were death himself." This took place in 2004-2005 in Germany. To this day, we lack a logical explanation for what he actually saw and experienced. The Ring Castle. This is a story of something that shook me to my very core, but also something that has made me realize that I need to be trained in some form to deal with the paranormal. It is going to be quite long, but keep with me. I am going to do everything one is not supposed to do in an instance like this, and I know that I was beyond stupid, and I definitely learned my lesson. Learn from my mistakes and be better. About a year ago, my wife and I moved to live in a community family household with my parents, which is a dream of mine. A few weeks ago I went to the Trelleborg Ring Castle during the Viking Festival, where I reenacted as a Viking during this festival. The festival is located in front of the UNESCO site Trelleborg. A little information about the site. It was raised by the very famous Harold Bluetooth between 970 to 980 AD, but behind it is a marshy, swampy area that has been used for religious practice and sacrifice since the Nordic Bronze Age, and some claim earlier. Men, women, and children have been sacrificed at this particular site. It was during the last days of the festival, and there was a big party. We had been drinking for a while, and me, my wife, and a group of young people we've met, decided to go there to see the full moon from the Ring Castle. The moment we walked on the ground of the site, I could feel the energies, but we were walking with this group with many non-believers, and we were being drunk, so I made a little fun of it. Very stupid, I know. My wife left because she said she felt anger, she is sensitive to energies as well, and I was like, whatever, and went in with the group of youngsters, and boy do I regret that. It wasn't long before I felt really unwelcome and decided to leave the group and go back to my wife. When I was walking with her, I felt something following me. It didn't feel bad or evil, more so a little jolly and playful, like a kid, and since kids have been sacrificed at this specific site, I felt sad for it, and I felt it had some sort of message to my wife, so I said, "Let it in," and she refused. Yes, I know I am stupid, so I proclaimed loudly, "If you won't, then I will," and that is when things and the feelings started to shift. The longer we got from the site, the more I realized that this wasn't something jolly, fun, or childish. As I stated previously, I have dealt with restless spirits before and know them and how they feel quite well. Something was off. The childish and jolly feeling had vanished. It didn't feel like a child anymore, in fact, it had stopped feeling human. This freaked me out, but I chose not to say anything to my wife. We got back to our tent, and I stated to her, "It stands outside of our tent," and she proclaimed loudly that it wasn't welcome inside and had to stay out there and return to the castle. It didn't. I woke up early that morning and felt horrible, I felt like my energies were being completely eaten and like I was being sucked dry. It felt almost like long claws had stuck themselves into my back. I called my mother, and very quickly she stated, "This is above my abilities, I cannot help you." So I called my father-in-law, who is a Sicilian man with very strong abilities, and he has dealt with spirits and powerful demonic forces, but even he was at a loss and didn't know what to do. During the day, a lot of people came and asked me if I was okay. I was pale and gray, and my eyes looked almost dead without soul, or so my wife described it. I decided to try to fix it myself and walk there during the day. Even during the day the energies were wild and all over the place. I usually don't hear things, but I did then and there, and I felt something. Something deep within the swamps area. Something very, very ancient. I felt even more drained and decided to leave and get real help. There is a woman there, at the Viking festival, who is very experienced with the energies of that specific place, and she deals with them on a regular basis. She is what we call a volve, which essentially is a priestess, spiritual leader, witch, or medium of Nordic spiritualism/asatro. I went to her, and she didn't even hesitate to help. She could see I needed it. She performed a mystical song known as Galder. I've met many spiritual people and have tried many spiritual practices, but never have I felt anything like that. The moment she started singing, everything was vibrating, and I felt completely confused. I felt the very moment where the song cut whatever it was from me or when it let go. And it honestly felt amazing when it let go and I became myself again. I talked with her for a while and found out some information. 1. The site had many, many restless spirits, but there is something else there. Something ancient. Something that does not want to be disturbed. Something that does not want us there. I was right in my feeling of it being non-human, but it wasn't demonic either. It was something ancient, older than the notion of demons, and I had angered it. 2. One should stay away during the night, and even Volvan isn't going there at night unless there is a true spiritual purpose. 3. Whatever it was had been angered deeply by our disturbance and latched onto me because of my untrained abilities. She made it very clear to me that even though she had removed it, it was up to me to keep it away and fix what I did. I live very close to the site, and she made it clear that if I didn't make peace with it or them, then it would find me again. I made a small blot there and promised to return regularly to do more blots, small sacrifices, to all the energies and spirits there, and I do believe that I've made peace with whatever thing I angered, and I've felt nothing spiritual for weeks now. This is my story, and here is some additional information. The Viking warrior group slept on the site grounds during the festival some years ago because they are loud and drink a lot. There were so many problems with that, and people experiencing stuff that the museum organizers never attempted that again. So this is an experience I had in 2018, when I was a management trainee with an organization, and it entailed a short 1 or 2 week stint across their major offices in different cities. Our office organized accommodation for us too. For my second stint, I was put in a city where I had never been before and had no friends or acquaintances. So, the company booked a hotel close to the office premises. The room was rather big and seemed very luxurious, albeit a bit old and shabby. What stumped me the most was how economical it was. The first night was uneventful, and for a woman traveling alone for the first time, it felt secure and comfortable. The second night, at about 9:30 p.m., I ordered in, and after finishing my dinner, I went out of my door to place the food trolley for collection by the staff. Just when I turned around to close my door, I saw someone staring at me from the corner of my eye. The person was at the end of the corridor, and it was very dimly lit. Let me add here that only 2 out of the 20 rooms on the floor were occupied and 10 were being renovated. Hence, the dim lighting at night. When I turned to look, the person ran out of view towards the elevator. I was creeped out, locked the room, and reported this to the reception. Third night, I was talking to my mom on a video call and heard heavy pacing and running at about 10 or 10:30 p.m. My mom heard it too. I sneaked to the peephole and saw no one. But I heard the footsteps right outside my door. Called the reception and they sent someone to check, who reported that there was no one, and I checked their CCTV footage. No one was there. Fourth night, I got a call on the hotel intercom, and when I answered, I heard only heavy breathing and low growling noises. This continued another 2 times before I called the reception again to raise a complaint. They checked their call panel records and said I had not received calls from any current hotel guest or staff lines. I checked again the next morning just to be sure, and they showed how the system is automated and no one can tamper with it. It showed no incoming or outgoing calls from my room. Fifth night, heard a constant knocking on the wall behind the bed, and it moved across the room, based on where I was standing. This creeped me out much more, and as someone diagnosed with hyperanxiety and depression, It felt like I was losing my mind, and I got an anxiety attack. I ran out of my room to the reception, 2 floors below, and the manager on duty calmed me down, and I was extremely upset. I questioned everyone around, and none of the staff said anything and said it was strange such things were happening. Later, a woman from my hometown, who was currently employed there, accompanied me to a new room they assigned me to. She told me in private that the floor I was on was sealed for 5 years and had recently been opened. Rumor has it that some old hotel staff had hurted a woman, and she was ended in the struggle. The administration covered it up and paid off the perpetrator and family of the victim and sold this property to the current owners. Since then, people have reported multiple occurrences on that floor. Also, these were major events. Some other small things happened, like the feeling of being watched constantly, cold spots, and feelings of nausea and panic. I checked out promptly the next morning and got another hotel, paying from my pocket, and have since then been extremely scared and anxious to be alone in any hotel room. I was a skeptic for a while until a plethora of paranormal events happened to and around me in order of increasing convincingness, plus some of my rationally trying to reason it away. Least convincing for me was anecdotal evidence provided by my parents that our new house was haunted, not that I think they were lying, but that their mind was playing tricks on them. Rationale, anecdotal evidence should always be taken with a grain of salt. Second least convincing was anecdotal evidence provided by my great aunt and uncle that they heard a knock at their door 2 hours after my grandfather died. Rational, see the above rationale. Third least convincing was that a knife that was cased under my bed came uncased around the same time my grandfather died. Rationale, I could have uncased it the night before and forgotten. Fourth least convincing was that I mysteriously found a burner running on low in the middle of the night. Rational, parents could have messed up and forgot, though I could have sworn I saw it off earlier in the night. The most convincing was that an orange tree died around the same time my grandfather died. It produced his favorite oranges. Rationale, correlation, not causation. Third most convincing was that a pendulum clock stopped ticking and swinging at the same time my grandfather died. Rationale, see above. The second most convincing was when my phone FaceTimed my friend on its own when everyone in the house was in another room together. Rational, technological glitch, though I had never heard of this happening. Most convincing was that a door opened right in front of me and my mom on its own, and the doorknob turned all the way around. The only other people in the house were A, accounted for, and B, could not have moved in a way that describes what we saw. There was no rational explanation for this, and we had a second witness who confirmed its authenticity. My son's father worked at a bar. It's an older building, and one day before they opened, I came in to see him. As I walked in, the other bartender told me he was in the basement where the liquor cage was and was taking inventory. He told me to go ahead down. As I turned the corner and looked down the rickety wooden stairs, I saw him, legs turning the corner at the bottom of the stairs, and called out to him. He kept walking, and I ran down the stairs calling him a couple more times. When I got to the bottom, I again saw him turn left around another corner and towards the back of the cellar. I followed him and was like, WTF, can you not hear me? The back of the cellar had an old freezer, and I figured he was grabbing a popsicle, but I couldn't see anything. Then out of nowhere I hear him call me from behind me. I turn around and he's inside the liquor cage. I was so confused. I literally followed him around the corner twice. Though I realized I hadn't really ever seen him. Like he was just barely in my sight both times. It was weird, but I didn't mention it to anyone until about a year later. I was drinking in the bar after close and just flippantly, and half jokingly, said, one time I saw a ghost in the basement, and 2 people looked at me really freaked out. We all told very similar stories. Following someone just out of sight and always in the basement. Dark pants. A male figure. It honestly spooked me. And I don't know. Never believed before. So I never believed in paranormal activity. My brother had never believed either. Then he moved into my dad's for a few years after college. One night he and I were at a bar drinking, and he looked at me and said, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I'm pretty sure Dad's house is haunted. When he's out of town, I hear people walking around upstairs. I've woken up in bed hearing loud noises that get louder and louder like they are coming at me, and I can't move until the noise stops. I pretty much laughed it off and chalked it up to night paralysis, since I experience it myself, and they are always accompanied by visual and audio hallucinations. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, my dad asks me to house sit since he's going to be gone for 2 weeks, and it is going to be a vacation for my roommates and me, so I accept. I stay in my brother's old room since it got converted to the guest room. The first 4 or 5 days go by, and nothing weird happens. Then it rained one night. I woke up and went upstairs. The light by the landing for the door and the kitchen light were both on. I chalk it up to being drunk the night before and just not turning them off. That night I'm in the basement playing some games. I go upstairs to get a drink, come back down, and notice a closet door was open that I didn't remember being opened. I attributed it to being cracked open, and when I opened the front door to check the mail, it was pulled open from suction, so I shut it and made sure it was completely shut. Another couple of days go by, with nothing. Then I'm lying in bed about to go to sleep when it sounds like someone was walking around above me. I figure it's just the house settling, but I keep hearing it, and it isn't the house settling. It is very distinct noises, heading in a direction, stopping, then heading back or in another direction. Every time I yelled up that I was calling the police, it would stop moving, then start back up. I had not called the cops because remembering what my brother had said, and the fact it would only temporarily stop when I yelled up. At this point I grabbed a baseball bat and headed upstairs, just in case. I turned on the lights, kept talking to the intruder, and I searched every inch of the upstairs. The way it is set up, there is no real way to go from room to room unnoticed. There are no hallways upstairs, just 3 rooms, 2 of which have wide openings to each other, and then a bathroom and bedroom in the corner. I searched for about an hour, then went back downstairs and shut off all the lights. About 10 minutes later it started up again. This time it lasted about 30 minutes. I didn't get any sleep, a few more days with nothing, and then one night I was in bed again, and I heard this faint 8-bit sounding music. It started slowly getting louder and louder. At this point I'm in full panic mode because of what my brother has said. Unlike him, I have no paralysis, so I jump out of bed, grab my pillow and blanket, and go out to the couch in the living room. I didn't hear the sound once I left the room. I stayed up watching TV for a bit before falling asleep on the couch. It rained again that night, and when I woke up, the closet that was open before was wide open again, and the light above the front door landing was on again. I was sober that night, and I know I hadn't opened the closet since there was no need for me to go into it, and I know the light was off, because if it is on when you're watching TV in the basement, it kind of blinds you. After that I stayed on the couch. There were no more instances besides another night it rained and the light being on again. When my dad came back, I asked him if he ever experienced anything weird in his house. He said he never had. I told him my story. Then he said he's always thought there might be something, because no matter what time of year, there is always a fly or two in his house, and he never has any other bugs. A couple of weeks after he came back, he called me after a rainstorm to say the light above the landing was on when he woke up. Since then he said the only times it happens is when it rains, and my brother or I had been at his house that week. I'm still not 100% a believer by any means. That being said, I still get goosebumps every time I tell anyone about it, including typing this out. I'm also a lot more open to believing weird things people tell me that seem unbelievable. My experience as a child that left me oddly traumatized. When I was 5 to 6, 20 years back, my mom and I moved into this small home in the country. No property size but still no neighbors or anything. Like 5 minutes from Walmart. The first experience happened in my bedroom. My bed was against the farthest left wall corner next to a window, and the door was in the farthest right corner. My room was always clean as we simply didn't have enough stuff to make it cluttered. I remember waking up and just knowing something was there, in the corner near the door. How? Because I remember thinking to myself, just close your eyes, just close your eyes. But I couldn't. I turned and had seen this lump, a figure made from my clothing. As in it was taller than me or anything I could have piled there. So in a shot in the dark, I beelined it to my mom, who was in the room adjacent to me, and said there was someone there. When she came and turned on the lights, she told me to come inside. Clothes were everywhere, all over the floor, just a chaotic mess. She asked me if I did this. I said no. Needless to say, I didn't sleep in my room that night. The second is what actually traumatized me, as in the specific action prior to the encounter made me panic for 6 years after. Flushing the toilet. I would have this deep anxious feeling no matter where and would run out of the washroom after. The washroom had only one entry, and the window was too small for a person to fit. The toilet was right next to the door. I did my business and flushed, and when I turned, there stood an old man. He was bearded, clean, and he just stood there looking at me. When I finally found my voice, I screamed, what my mom and I quote sounded like a blood-curdling scream, like you had cut off a finger. She came in to find me closing my eyes, hands covered them, and said there was a man in there with me. It took her time to console me to open up and talk further. We didn't stay much longer in that house. Note, it's important to state my mom was the one who verified my stories as an adult. Since then, I've spent years trying to either connect with whatever sense I had to see that person or dismiss what I had seen as something else, but I can't. Between the long-term fear/anxiety/trauma from the event and my mom's own account of the event secondhand, I can't find an actual explanation for the events. My grandma owns an old Swedish three-legged witching table. I didn't believe it at first until I got it from her. I just thought it was cool, nothing else, until I heard it move. It was about 4 in the morning, and I heard someone tapping loudly on the floor. I didn't think much of it, but when I got up, I noticed that the table wasn't in my living room anymore, it was in my downstairs kitchen. How did it go down the stairs? My thoughts were solely focused on it. I lifted it up the stairs to the living room, there it stayed for 2 nights. I woke up one morning and found it at my bedside. I got a bit creeped out, but I put it back in the living room, and then I went on vacation. The week I came back, the table was nowhere to be found until a few weeks later when I walked into my living room and found it where I had left it the week before I went on vacation. I decided to put a large and heavy printer on it, and it hasn't moved since. When I later asked my grandma about it, she said that everyone who had done something to it or asked things you shouldn't ask has died and is trapped in it. My uncle Harry carved his name in under it, and he later took his own life, hanged himself in his barn. My grandma's friend Christina asked if she was going to die soon, and so she did. In a car accident, she was barely recognized, and lastly we have my grandma, who asked if her mom was going to die because she was very sick, and the table said yes to all of the questions. And my great-grandma died from her sickness. Not sure what it was, but I believe it was sepsis. My other uncle Håkon asked if there would be a mining accident at his work, and the table said yes. Later that same week, the mining shaft collapsed, and he lost his leg, and a few friends of his got crushed. There you have it. That's why I believe in the supernatural. A true haunting in the country. To start, I've been a strong believer in the paranormal since I was a young child. I have childhood stories that I'd like to share at a later time. But for now, I'd like to talk about what happened to me about 10 years ago. I've never been more afraid of the other side than that time. I've never submitted a story before, but I felt that I needed to share about this experience. To share it with people who maybe have experienced some of the same things. It's a little long, but nonetheless scary. It was the summer of 2007. My husband, daughter, and I had to move from where we were living to a trailer in a very rural community away from my hometown where I grew up. To give you an idea of the area, forests surrounded everything. Our trailer was right next to the only main road. Behind us was a cow field, then 4 other trailers in a line about a half-mile away from us. It was a very nice location, and the inside was just what we needed with a 7-year-old. But I always had a strange feeling, like something lurking behind my shoulder. I just shrugged it off as being stress from moving away from my hometown to a brand new area. The activity was very slow and small to start. I would hear small bangs and knocks on the walls and the front door glass, but we had 3 cats, so I thought it could be them. Sometimes I would think the trailer was just settling. Then at times I thought it was my daughter, Max, making some of the noises. But she always said she wasn't. I did believe in the paranormal, but ghosts hadn't come to my mind yet. Then, one night, everything changed. My husband, Charlie, worked evenings at a restaurant 60 miles away and didn't get off until late, anywhere from 2 to 4 a.m. I had a futon in our living room where I was sitting watching a movie. My daughter was asleep in her room, and all 3 of our cats were asleep in various spots around the living room. It was about 2 a.m. as I was waiting on Charlie to come home. I had the lights off because I was watching a horror movie, as I've always loved watching them in the dark. First, I got a chill of cold around me, which I just thought was our air conditioner in the kitchen. But I then realized I had turned it off several hours ago, because I'm a naturally cold person. Before I could shrug it off, it felt like 3 fingers ran through the left side of my hair above my ear. I immediately got goosebumps all over my body, and I sat straight up and shook my hair out, thinking maybe a spider, but I left denial behind. I knew those were fingers running through my hair. I shuddered and barely slept at all that night. The next day, I called a few of my friends to tell them what I had experienced. My friend Jay said she could come over and we could do an EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, experiment. She thought that by making contact with me, maybe they wanted to communicate. So, she and my friend M came over armed with a digital recorder and a Ouija board. Charlie went to work as usual, and about 9 p.m. I put Max to bed. We sat around talking girl talk for a bit, and I had told the girls about the small occurrences, like the knocking on the walls and windows, especially on the front door. So, around 3 a.m., we decided to get started. We turned out the lights, lit 3 candles, and placed our fingers on the planchette. Then, we turned on the recorder. The house was very quiet, so, starting with Jay, we started asking questions. Jay asked, "Is anyone here?" The planchette moved slowly to yes. Just a note, I had used spirit boards before, so I knew the rules and how everything was supposed to work. We went around in a circle asking simple questions like, "Where are you?" and "How did you pass?" We kept getting answers spelled out like "Here" and "the well." We had an in-ground oil well behind our house at the time. The board then spelled out, "I like you." M asked, "Who do you like?" The planchette sat still for a moment, then moved to where it was pointing at me. At that point, I started getting a bit queasy and had chills up and down my body. I asked J and M if we could stop and maybe review the recorder. We said goodbye to the board and then rewound the tape. We all sat, eager to see if we had captured anything. There weren't any responses to the first few questions. Then, we hear J ask, "Where are you?" We hear a small, childlike voice come through and say, "Outside." The hairs on the back of my neck started to raise. Next, we hear M ask, "How did you pass?" And we hear a faint voice of a woman who cries, "So cold." At this point on the tape is where the board is spelling out "I like you." You hear M say, "Well, who do you like?" Then, in a deep male voice, sounding as if almost slithering out of the speaker, "Nikki." To this day, I still get chills of fear when I think of that voice. At that exact moment when my name came out of the recorder, it felt as if a very strong force pushed down on my shoulders. Like hands pressing down hard. I felt extremely sick and stopped the tape immediately. Jay said a blessing, but it didn't really relieve the pressure. Charlie ended up coming home, and the girls decided to go to sleep. Charlie and I lay down, and he fell right to sleep. But I had this extreme wave of fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel someone watching me closely. I opened my eyes quickly, and to my horror, I saw a very dark, male-shaped shadow on my ceiling directly above me. I've never suffered from sleep paralysis, and as soon as I opened my eyes, it vanished. I sat straight up, my chest feeling heavy and tight to where I was having trouble breathing. I was shaking and trying to wake Charlie up to tell him what I saw. But he was too out of it. So, I sat there in my bed curled in a ball until the dawn came. Then I could finally close my eyes and sleep. From then on, everything was different. I was always cold, even though temperatures reached 80 degrees. The shower, other than the bed, was the scariest place in the house. I would go to take a shower and always have my water pretty hot. But every time I'd undress and get in, I'd feel that familiar cold swirl around my body. I would get chills all over. At one point, I could even see my breath. It was freezing in the shower. I went from showering once a day to once a week. I just couldn't take it. Every day was the same. I'd have enormous pressure on my shoulders, I'd have panic attacks out of nowhere, I'd have a lot of difficulty breathing, and I'd have that feeling at night. That damned feeling. Whatever was haunting me loved tormenting me. Always staying on the ceiling. Making sure I would see him just for a split second. I don't know if it was because we opened up a doorway when we used the board that night, but I always think back and wish we had left it alone. I do feel that it still would have escalated, but slower without the board. About September of that year, I was able to move back to my hometown. I was terrified that whatever had a hold of me in the country would follow me. When I got back home, I looked up some spells and rituals to cast away negative beings and spirits. I never felt that presence again. But, to this day, I will never forget that voice or what happened. It has strengthened me as a person. For anyone thinking of using a spirit board, just be careful. You could release something very devious that wants you but needs a way to get to you. My dad crawled out from under my bed. I was around 6 when it happened. My parents had tucked me in for bed. I live in the rural countryside, so nighttime is very quiet, with no sounds of cars. It's usually very peaceful. I was lying on my back when suddenly I heard the sound of long nails scratching the wood under my bed. The reason this incident sticks out to me is because I can still remember the feeling of my heart dropping out of my stomach and feeling paralyzed with fear. I was about to call out for my parents when my dad crawled out from under my bed and stood up in the dark looking at me. He said, "You forgot to say your prayers," then walked out of my room. I was understandably shocked. I did not leave my bed afterwards and must have fallen asleep at some point. My dad would normally tell me to say my prayers before bed, so this seemed like something he would say, but I have no idea what would possess him to hide under my bed. My dad denies ever doing this. I brought it up numerous times over the years, but he has never admitted to doing it. I never really considered until recently that he definitely doesn't have nails long enough to make the deep scratching sound I heard. What do you guys think? Maybe I fell asleep and had a vivid dream. I also considered it could be something paranormal. Growing up, I didn't know if spirits/ghosts were real. My mind was open to the idea, but I had never experienced anything to believe it. Anyways, I was 23 when I first moved out of home to my first apartment. I'm 28 now, so this was some time back. I will say that living there for the most part was normal, but on a couple of occasions there were some moments that sent chills down my spine. The first time, I was chillin' with my lady friend. We were just lying on my couch watching a movie or something. The kitchen was small, so looking at the TV, you can see the whole kitchen. I had a cheap trash can where the top lid spins, so to dispose of the trash, you just throw it in. We were just chillin', and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the lid spin a few times, as if someone slapped it to make it spin. I noticed it but didn't say anything. My lady friend asks me, like, 10 seconds later, if I saw that. I was like, holy shit, I wasn't tripping. We investigated the trash, and nothing. At first, I thought a rat jumped into it or something. We didn't have a rat problem, but I had no idea what else could have done that. In short, we had no idea what the hell it was, and we were quite shook for a while. The second moment made my heart sink, and I have never felt that feeling ever since. So my GF would come over a lot. This was after my lady friend. I'm not a cheater. She, among a few of my other friends, always told me my apartment had a bad vibe. Like the energy in there was dark. I didn't think much about it. Anyways, we had these two stuffed animals we won at a claw machine at our local arcade. After a time of her feeling uneasy, for some reason we both concluded those stuffed animals just gave off bad vibes. She removed them off the bookshelf and put them in my kitchen cabinet before I left for work, just to put them away for the time being. Keep in mind, I dropped her off at her house, and she didn't have a key to the apartment, and I always double locked it. Fast forward, I get back from work and decide to take a nap. I lay on my couch, and the way I was lying, the bookshelf was in front of me a bit to the left side of the wall. At the time I was having a lot of sleep paralysis. I still do from time to time, but in hindsight I did experience a lot of sleep paralysis in that damn apartment, so of course, I'm waking up in sleep paralysis mode. My eyes open, unable to move, and I look, and all I see is those two stuffed animals sitting in the exact spot they were at. My first thoughts were, WTF, how the hell did those get back on there? It was impossible for those things to get back on that shelf unless they walked their asses back, which is obviously impossible, or is it? My heart sank into my gut, I felt my skin crawl, and that feeling of unease just took over my body. After I was finally able to move, I called her and asked if she put them back before we left the apartment, and she swore up and down she didn't. She couldn't believe what I was telling her, as we were both in disbelief. I disposed of those two stuffed animals in the big trash, this time certain they would never pop up again. I still consider myself a skeptic, as I never again had any other experiences with what I believe was paranormal, but the couple of times I did, it was at those damn apartments. I actually had a friend who grew up in them, and she told me they were definitely haunted. That she's seen and heard things there too. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed listening to them. Cheers. I was 100% a non-believer until I got into this situation. We were in grade 12 summer, probably 15 years ago. In the evening, after a few drinks in a friend's garage, we began talking about Fort San, an old place where sick people stayed long ago. People said it was haunted, but some of us didn't believe it. To prove who was right, we decided to check it out for ourselves. We drove for 45 minutes to get there. The place looked old and empty, with a big fence around it. We found a way in through a dry riverbed and climbed up the fire escape to the top floor, then pulled some wood off a window on the top floor to get inside. The top floor, I honestly can't remember how many stories the building was, 3 or 4? We checked out. It seemed normal. After it was decommissioned as a hospital, it was used for conferences, and people could stay in the rooms. The first few floors had nothing but old beds and rooms that were emptied or gone through. As we used the interior stairwell, we opened doors carefully, using chairs to make sure they wouldn't lock behind us. At this time the skeptics were laughing at the whole situation, at how anyone could be scared of this place. My one friend, feeling desperate, I think, told us about the basement being the place where they would cremate the children that died of tuberculosis. So down we went. By the time we got to the basement, things felt really creepy. But creepy, like you're in an abandoned building creepy, not ghosts are present creepy. The walls were old and falling apart, and it smelled weird. Plus, it was so dark down there that only a few of us with flashlights could see where we were going. At this point in the basement we all split up. In one room, we found a strange tunnel-like opening in the wall. Just large enough to crouch in, you wouldn't have to crawl to get through this tunnel. But you couldn't stand upright either. Just then, I realized I was standing in something wet on the floor. Shining a light on it, I saw it was blood. We called all the other guys to come over. I assumed one of my friends got hurt breaking glass or something and wanted to make a scene. When everyone gathered, none of us was hurt, and we all got a little uneasy feeling, and you could tell people were ready to leave. Then, we heard loud banging sounds from the doors we had propped open. They had slammed shut. And, looking down the tunnel, we saw moving shadows. We debate to this day what we saw, but it looked like kids' shadows running past the opening at the far end. Freaked out, we ran to get out. We were able to get up the stairs to the main floor because we didn't go through any doors. But the chair we put in front of the other door was gone, and the door was shut tight. We found a window, kicked out the wood covering it, and ran to our car as fast as we could. To this day, my friends and I can't agree on what happened. Some think someone was hiding in there, playing tricks on us. But none of us were about to go back and find out. Went through an abandoned hospital. A girl in our group got hurt without coming into physical contact with anyone or anything. Ghost hunters confirmed the presence of something abnormal. The next time we went hunting would, in fact, be my last. The leaders of the hunt had gotten permission to enter an old, shut-down hospital, more of a clinic, in a small and remote town near their headquarters. The abandoned facility had a reputation, and this was why they first set up in proximity to the clinic. The building was the constant target of vandalism and other nefarious after-dark activities. There were no well-defined ghost stories about the place, but it had a reputation of having a bad vibe. Word spread, and it became a bit of a hotspot for ghost hunting until it was finally sold and torn down to make way for a gas station. The ghost hunting crew we were with previously brought the same equipment and another member of staff with them. The bosses oriented the newcomers and gave us all the same rules: avoid talking if possible, stick to the safe words, and stay together. This time we all rode in the same vehicle, a 15-seater van. We got underway, and immediately upon arrival at our destination, things felt creepy. Chalk it up to nerves, excitement, or actual ducking demonic presence. Your call. We were encouraged to use our own smartphones' audio and video recorders, and we even installed a few different anomaly detecting apps before our adventure that night. The night guard/groundskeeper met us at the gate and asked for our IDs. We'd get them back if we respected the place and didn't wreck or vandalize anything. Then, he actually joined us as we walked around taking readings and recordings. What essentially became a slow tour of the building was quiet and uneventful. There were piles of trash and broken bottles all over, and the smell of rot and mold permeated the majority of the place. As a side note, I was playing Last of Us at home in my free time. This fact did wonders for my imagination in this place that smelled the way I assumed clickers smelled. We were deep into the basement and had essentially explored every room in the building when the highlight of the evening played out. Walking in a small cluster that was basically the 3 professionals up front and 2 rows of 4 people. So 12 people in total, counting the groundskeeper. My fiancé, my brother, his wife, and I were in the back row, furthest from the leaders, when one of the girls in front of us, a girl my fiancé worked with, screamed and cried that something touched her back, and it really hurt. She was wearing a tank top that exposed her neck, shoulders, and lower back. It was obvious right away that her back was scratched to shit. Small pricks and lines of blood had already formed, like she had crouched under a tree with low branches. Her back was dominated by long vertical lines of red scratches that were not there seconds before. We were behind her the entire time, and the clinic was lit enough to notice something like this long before her screams. We immediately called it quits and walked back to the parking lot as fast and safely as we could. The whole time the girl was whining about how bad her back hurt. Under the light of the guardhouse, it became apparent that the scratches on her back looked like someone had raked their hands down her back. The marks even went below her belt line and into her pants. She said her legs hurt too, and she dropped her pants in the van, showing us that she was scratched from shoulder to mid-thigh. She cried the whole way home, and we declined going back to the hunter's place to see and hear the recordings. That girl stayed at our place that night and woke up screaming several times until the sun came up. She still had the marks in the morning, though the irritation had subsided quite a bit. I don't like talking about this one. It got too real, and I don't have a good way of explaining what happened, outside the paranormal. She was far too clothed to have grazed anything that left these marks, and her clothes weren't damaged. I don't see how she could have been a plant, as my wife knew her, and she'd never hunted with us before. It didn't make sense, and I try not to fill in the blanks because it puts my imagination in a mode that's hard to get out of. The guys that led the expedition got in touch with my wife a few days later. They said that the recording didn't pick up anything strange at all until the girl screamed. Then the needles jumped all over the place. Readings stayed consistent and didn't subside as we quickly left that part of the building and exited the facility. They surmised that based on the footage, recording, and matching time stamps, it looked like something followed us until we got out of the front doors. Grain of salt. They also told her the night guard had quit. The place was leveled years later. My wife and I divorced, and I don't go hunting anymore. The company we went with was called Salt City Ghost Tours, and I don't think they hunt with other people or do civilian tours anymore, but my now ex talked to them occasionally. I assume she still does. I have always been the type to be hyper-aware of my surroundings. Since I was a young child, I have been deathly shy and in turn have learned to listen/observe rather than speak. Due to this characteristic of mine, I tend to notice little things, as well as feel deeply in tune with the paranormal. Despite this connection, I still choose to be skeptical of the existence of the paranormal, that is, until it comes to my personal experiences. The encounter took place during a summer vacation at my grandparents' house, I being about 12 years old at the time. The house was a very old farmhouse built in the northeastern countryside of the United States. I do not know much of the history surrounding the area or home other than personal family history. My parents, siblings, dog, and I all were staying in the home for about a week, overnight. The house had 3 floors, and I chose to sleep on the top floor alone. The home had an overwhelmingly eerie feeling to it after passing the 2nd floor. The atmosphere fully changed, and I can say that I did not sleep well those nights. However, I don't know how much of that could be attributed to just being young and easily scared. One day, the whole family was over for a backyard barbecue. Everyone was outside enjoying their time together, and for whatever reason, I left for a moment. I can't remember if I had to use the bathroom or simply left something upstairs, but I remember the way back down all too well. I rounded the corner leading to the staircase, and at the bottom of the steps my eyes were met with my dog. I called his name, and he turned his head with a strange expression on his face. It was just blank, and his body language was off. Everything seemed wrong. He was not wagging his tail, his eyes were cold, and his movements, walking, were slow. Then, without reason, he turned his head from me and walked straight, disappearing out of my sight. What was the most peculiar about this was that when walking straight, there was nothing other than a wall, meaning I had just witnessed my dog walk through a wall after acting completely out of character. I screamed as I immediately registered that what I had just witnessed was literally impossible. I then ran down the staircase until I reached my family outside the house. I ran to my father in the hopes of being comforted, but to my horror I saw something that made my experience even more impossible than it already was. There, in front of me, was my dog, tied to a pole. He was on a leash, unable to move past the length of about 5 feet. I asked my father frantically how long my dog had been there, and he explained that he had been next to him, while he was tied up, for the past hour. Seeing him in the stairwell was impossible as he was not allowed in the house, but he was also confirmed and witnessed to be somewhere else. I tried to tell my family about this, I've told friends about this, yet no one believes me. They pretend they do, but then I see that look in their eyes that tells me they are only pretending to spare my feelings. I know what I saw that day, and no one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I used to like to think that what I saw that day was possibly the spirit of a deceased loved one saying goodbye. However, I don't know if I still feel that way. The presence was not especially warm. It was not especially cold either, but I feel if it was a loved one, it would have been warmer. Whatever that figure was, it was not my living dog, I know that. I today found out about something called mimics, who I believe are demons who impersonate loved ones. This prompted me to finally make this post, as what if what I saw that day was something darker than I originally thought? That would explain the darkness I felt on that top floor or the strange movements and atmosphere surrounding the figure. I truly don't know what to think, and 10 years later, I'm still as baffled as I was then. If anyone knows what this might have been or why it happened, please let me know. The many hauntings of Morris Hill. In the south of Kentucky sits Morris Hill. Morris Hill is known to have had some creepy things happen, and the places in Morris Hill alone are pretty creepy themselves. When I was about 5, I had lost my mother and ended up moving in with my grandmother. My grandma and grandpa lived deep in Morris Hill. My grandpa actually owned very much of Morris Hill. When I was younger, I wasn't really scared of the place we lived in. I just thought some events were odd. In my time living with my grandparents, we moved houses in Morris Hill many times. The last house that we moved into happened to be the worst. We lived deep in the hill. Our house had a gravel driveway that was about 2 minutes long, the trees draped over the whole driveway. When you got to our house, we had a big yard, but the whole house was overall surrounded by the forest. Now I was initially happy about moving to this house because I hadn't had a very good experience at the home I lived in before. In my former home, I was lying in bed one night, I would say I was around 7 years old. I randomly woke up one night hanging halfway on my bed, and my right elbow was in excruciating pain. All of a sudden, I was on the floor. At that time I didn't understand what was happening. I started screaming and crying, and my grandmother ran in and took me to the kitchen to wash it off, and it turns out my whole elbow had been sliced open. Somehow the meat had violently been sliced off my elbow. I wouldn't let my grandmother take me. This story will be important later. So at this new house I was very excited to have moved. It was a new start, new memories, and I felt safe here. Little did I know, this house wasn't going to be my safe place. The first few weeks of living in this home, I was so happy. I told my grandma it was so much easier to sleep at night, and I loved my room. The longer we lived in this house, though, the stranger it got. Towards the end of my 4th grade year, I had to get my tonsils removed. I had very bad issues with them, and they were actually poisoning my body, so it was an emergency to get them removed. The morning that I went to the hospital was very strange. I and my grandma got into the car. Now let me remind you, my grandma isn't a typical grandma. She loved to wear one of two things, t-shirts and ball shorts or dressy shirts and skirts. She had long black hair down to her waist. It was gorgeous. Anyways, this morning was odd. We got into the car, and right before we started it, we heard a voice. This voice said, "I'm here with you, I love you." I and my grandma looked at each other, eyes wide in confusion. The reason we were confused is because this voice was one we knew. This was my mother's voice. My grandma told me my mother was my guardian angel. I'll never forget that morning. After my surgery I woke up to lots of presents. One of the presents being a safari light that spins. If you don't know what this is, it's pretty much a light that is kind of a spinning film inside, and it just lights up the room and puts animal shapes on the walls. One night, many months after my surgery, I fell asleep with this light on, which wasn't usual because I typically slept in the dark. At this time I had a bunk bed in my room because I like to have friends over pretty often. I was lying on the bottom bunk one night. This night was a school night, so I had no friends over. I opened my eyes randomly that night and saw a woman in my closet. I stared at her for at least 3 seconds, then turned over, facing the opposite direction of her, throwing my cover over my head. I was in such shock I wanted to cry, but nothing would come out. The woman in my closet had mid-length red hair with a white gown on. Her face had many scars. I remember vividly how her body was dripping water onto the floor and her hair was soaking wet. As I was lying there trying to calm down, I could hear breathing for at least 10 seconds. It eventually went away. Somehow I worked up the courage to flip back around and face whatever was there. When I did, she was gone. I burst out of my bedroom and ran all the way across the house to my grandmother's bedroom. I was terrified I ended up sleeping in there that night. This is only the first out of very many strange things to happen in this house. One evening after school I got off the bus and came inside. I was in 6th grade, so I was going through a phase where I loved blasting music in my headphones. I had my headphones on, and I was blaring music as I walked into my room. I had a mirror hanging by my closet, and I was being a typical 12-year-old, singing and dancing in the mirror. At one point I looked in the mirror and saw that behind me was a person. This person had a white bag over its head. It terrified me, and I took off running to my grandma yet again. I told her what I saw, and she just tried calming me down, telling me it was my imagination. 6th grade happened to be the year I got hooked on Musical.ly. This was when it had first become popular. In one of my videos, I never noticed until a friend pointed out there was something behind me in the corner. It looked like the outline of the woman I had seen in my closet a few months after my surgery. It scared me severely. I deleted the video and tried forgetting it happened. A few nights after I woke up to my alarm clock blaring rock and roll music at 3 in the morning, it scared me so bad my heart dropped. When I got into 7th grade, some strange things happened. I started having sleep paralysis pretty occasionally. Every time I had sleep paralysis, I've always seen the same figure. I call him the 7-foot man. The reason I call him the 7-foot man is because he's very tall, and he's just a black shadow. I've heard stories of shadow people, and I honestly believe this is what he is. I never bothered telling my grandma about this because I knew she would tell me it was my imagination. In the summer of 2017, my grandma and I had to go to town to get a few things. The reason being it was storming and we had tornado warnings, so we wanted to stock up on food. For some reason my grandma acted skeptical about going that night. I asked over and over what was wrong, but she wouldn't say. Now since we lived on a hill, the road to get to town was harder to drive on, especially when it was raining or snowing. The road is very curvy because it's too steep to put a straight road all the way down. That night that we were headed to the store was the most horrific night of my life. As we were going down Morris Hill, my grandma was very cautious, checking each side of the road. At one point I thought that maybe she was just checking for animals, making sure she didn't hit them. But as we kept going, I noticed the road was changing. It was getting very foggy, almost too foggy to drive. I was leaned up in the passenger seat trying to help my grandma see the turns as a huge thud hit the car. This thud came from the roof. I was freaking out, but my grandma kept driving, trying to ignore it. Little did I know, she knew what was happening. This thing on top of our car was walking on all fours toward the windshield. I couldn't see this thing yet, I could only hear it. As I looked up at the top of the windshield, I watched as two hands pressed against the glass. These hands were very skinny and dirty. A woman slowly crawled down onto the front of our car. I was screaming because I was terrified. But my heart dropped when the woman turned around in the car. This was no woman, her face wasn't right. Her eyes were on fire, and she had no nose, no eyebrows, no ears, nothing but a mouth. She screamed the scream of a bobcat. As she screamed, you could see her wicked sharp teeth. At this point I was sure we were going to die. I was crying my eyes out, meanwhile my grandma was still driving. She drifted the curves trying to throw this thing off the car, in which at one point she succeeded. When we made it to town, she parked at a rundown car wash, took me by the hand, and told me she needs to tell me some things. My grandma told me she figured I was old enough to know these things now. She told me the night that my elbow had been sliced, she saw something as she was running into the room to get me. Apparently there was a woman standing in the corner with long fingernails. This is why we moved out of that house so soon after, which also made sense of why my grandmother slept in the bed with me every night until we moved. She later said that what had just happened to us had happened to her before, but not with me, with my cousin Jacob. Around 8 years before it happened to me and her, it was raining, and the same thing happened to her and Jacob. She told me many strange things happen on Morris Hill. She said the reason her and my grandpa owned lots of Morris Hill was because they didn't want a lot of people living up there due to the crazy things that would happen. After knowing this, everything had all made sense now. I remembered things I didn't before. One main thing I remembered in that moment was when I was 6, we lived at the bottom of Morris Hill. My grandma would have people over, and she would tell me to stay outside. She was a very spiritual woman, so it all made sense. One day I didn't listen, and I walked inside when she told me to stay outside. I didn't know what she was doing then, but all of a sudden it all made sense. She was performing an exorcism. My grandma and grandpa owned tons of Morris Hill and performed exorcisms because they knew that strange things existed. They knew the people of Morris Hill got dragged into the wrong things and even got possessed at times. She told me that I have to trust her and my grandpa. She later said if something were to happen to her, to leave Morris Hill immediately. She told me she loved me with all her heart. Later that summer my grandma actually passed away. At some point in time, she had developed a brain tumor, and the doctors performed surgery. She got to come home. For about 3 days everything was great. But one morning I walked into her room to find her cold in her bed. I remembered the words she told me. Even though I was heartbroken, I left Morris Hill as soon as I could, and I've never gone back. What solidified my belief in the paranormal is a first-hand experience of a violent ghost. If I recall correctly, this took place in early December of 2006. At the time, I was 13 years old and was playing with fireworks. I was at the back of our house, right in front of an empty apartment where my nephew and sister-in-law used to live. It was uninhabited for 6 months or so, playing with fireworks by myself since I don't have any close friends in our town. I have a box of fireworks that look like a chubby matchstick. Don't be fooled by its size. A single stick can blow your fingers off, and a lit candle for easy ignition. It was dark as duck, so I went inside the empty apartment to switch the light on. I'm having a really good time blowing shit up. A box contains 30 sticks, so it took me 20 minutes to empty a box. After finishing blowing 30 sticks, I went inside the apartment to switch off the light, and as I turned around to head for the exit, something slashed my back. I'm not sure slashed is the right word for it since I did not feel it cross from point A to point B. It was instantaneous, if you will. I thought a wire snapped behind me and hit my back, but I don't see any wires. I can't debunk it. But what bothers me is I didn't feel my shirt move at all. I was slashed from the inside. It wasn't painful at first, but there's a feeling of uneasiness in my back. So I went inside the house, and what comes next is the most painful burning sensation I've ever experienced. My back is throbbing from pain, so painful that I fell on my knees. I wailed for my mom to grab something cold to apply to the area. My mother was shocked to see a ginormous mark on my back. Up to this day, I can literally feel the raised scar on my back. It looks like a scar you get from a branding iron. Shared experience that's making me question things. A friend of mine encouraged me to share this here in case there's someone else who might have experienced something similar. I apologize for any rambling that might occur. I've been a skeptic up until this point. For context, I, 26, female, have been having both visual and auditory hallucinations since my late teens. They're not terribly intrusive, and I've gotten to the point where I can either quickly recognize they're not real or dismiss them entirely. I'm talking about misshapen objects, music, disembodied voices, and occasionally I'll believe I'm having a conversation with a friend or family member that was all in my head. Seeing an entire person as a hallucination is rare for me. I've only just recently been seeing someone for these hallucinations, because my mom's side of the family is incredibly religious / has negative views of mental health, so me mentioning these things was extremely discouraged, and I'd get alienated for a while each time I did. My dad's side of the family is the opposite. Most of my uncles, as well as my father, have all had paranormal experiences, but the amount of stories I've been told is too many to mention. Now to the main reason for sharing this. My father and I like to go fishing sometimes. We live in the south and would go to the coast around midnight and stay out till maybe 3 or 4 in the morning before driving back home. A few weeks ago we went fishing again and bounced around a few spots along the coast till our last fishing spot. It was 2:30 a.m. Everything was quiet, and there weren't any people or cars around. I was carrying some lawn chairs and our tackle box to the edge of the pier where I saw a man standing at the edge of it and facing away from me. He was wearing black pants, and I think he had a hoodie. Naturally, I said good morning to him and quickly set the things down and went back down the pier to meet my dad, who was carrying our fishing rods and net. I let him know that a man was at the end of the pier, and he went to go drop off our things while I went to the car to grab my jacket. I wasn't even there for a minute before I was heading back down the pier, and I found my dad just standing there, but now the man was gone. I asked my dad where the guy went, and my dad has this confused expression on his face. He said that he had asked the man, "Anything biting tonight?" with the assumption the guy was there fishing like we were. When the guy didn't respond, my dad had turned around to set down our poles, but when he turned back around to face the guy, he was gone. No footsteps, no splash of water to show he'd jumped in, nothing. And even if the man had managed to silently leave the pier, he would have had to pass me on the way back. And I didn't see him. My dad thinks we saw a ghost, because we both know we saw and spoke to this man. I would have just assumed I'd hallucinated again, but my dad also saw this guy literally a couple feet away from him. My dad isn't the type of guy to humor my hallucinations or even make jokes about it. In fact, he's pretty adamant that I'm not mentally ill or anything and that I just see spirits, so this shared experience is making me question a bunch of things I've seen and dealt with in the past. I'm not saying everything I've experienced is an apparition or something, but there are a few now that I'm starting to wonder whether I was really seeing something or my head was making it happen. I will add that when we packed up to leave about an hour later, we saw a cross and flowers left along another pier because someone had apparently died there recently. Dunno how or who or if it's connected to the man I saw. My dad certainly thinks so. I don't know. My therapist is encouraging me to not invest too much into these thoughts until our next session. I know this was long, and like I said, I've got a lot of stories with me seeing things as well as stories from my dad, my uncles, and my grandfather. This is just the most recent thing that's really making me overthink. 31-year story of my paranormal life. Poltergeist. I'm not exactly sure how to start this off, but this is going to be a collection of paranormal experiences I've had through the 31 years of my life, from early years, 1993, up to February of 2024. Some of the timelines might be fuzzy, but the events are true. I'll start with childhood and lead up to the present day through writing. I grew up in a house with both parents and a sister in a fairly new, single-story house with no paranormal history. My sister is just shy of 2 years younger than me. At birth, my sister and I had been baptized and grown up in a Catholic family. Our parents weren't very churchy people, but our grandparents were the old school, heavy Catholic type. My parents would recall stories to us when we were very little, such as my room was the coldest in the house no matter what. This could have been caused by how the ventilation was built for the house, so that wasn't anything too wild. Other things they said were hearing loud bands on the other side of the house when they were home, pantry doors and silverware drawers being opened when they would come home, and having the washer and dryer start up on their own. They don't remember any of this happening prior to me, the firstborn, being born. As far as I'm aware, they never sold my soul to any demons, because we sure never had much luck or money lol. As far as this activity goes, I don't really remember any of this taking place. And I feel like if I did, I wouldn't understand the magnitude of it all. One instance I do recall is being around 7 years old and being at a close friend's house. We were sitting on the floor of his bedroom playing Yu-Gi-Oh! He had one of those small Nickelodeon TVs in there, and the remote was on the floor. While we were playing, the remote was going back and forth under his bed and out in front of us. We just stared at this in awe. Not realizing this was ducking insane, we just went on about our lives as if nothing happened. Moving into later childhood and teen years, things picked up. My sister had started to tell my mom and me that she was seeing shadows and felt uncomfortable. My mom also told us she was seeing shadows, and it was intermittent when this would occur. I had personally never seen what they were talking about and was thankful. All I recall during that time was hearing footsteps outside of my room. We had since moved into a trailer due to some tragic life issues, and my mom would tell us that it was some animal under the floor causing the noises. I put full faith into that thought at the time, but looking back, there is no ducking way. The footsteps would be constant till I moved out. I was in this home from 5 years old till about 22. Growing up, I would always stay the night at friends' houses for Halo Land parties and try to recreate the food we saw on Epic Meal Time. One of my friends had some paranormal things going on over there. I can't specifically tie these events to what I dealt with, I just think it was a wild coincidence. He had told us he believed a little girl was haunting his house and had dealt with various things like noises and sightings. One specific night I remember lying on the floor going to bed after another solid gaming sesh, and I could hear this Faith Carousel music. I put up with it for a few minutes. Finally, I said, "Hey, can you shut the volume off on your DS? We can't sleep." Turns out he was out cold, and that wasn't him. After I woke him up, we just sat there and stared at each other. He told me he had toys in the attic and that he thought the little girl was playing with them. So, like most level-headed teenage boys, we decided to ghost hunt. At the time, the show on Sci-Fi, Ghost Hunters with the TAPS team, was huge. We had this old school recording device and would walk around the house asking questions, waiting for a response. We finally got the balls to crawl into the attic where the noises had been coming from and began to have a classic EVP session. It was pitch black outside of the little flashlight we brought. There were about 5 of us seated on the beams asking whatever came to our minds. After some time up there and no responses that we could hear, we wrapped up and came down but left the recorder up there for a period of time that escapes my memory. As we played the tape back, we got to the point where we shut the attic and were all back downstairs and actually had caught a little girl saying, "Mommy?" And we were shitting bricks. I mean, we got what we wanted to find, but you don't really think you would hit on anything. Fast forward a bit towards high school, my mom would ask me if I was moving shampoo bottles in her bathroom. As a typical teenage asshole, I love doing pranks, but this wasn't me, and my sister isn't that kind of person. This would happen once a month or so, it felt like. Along with this we would have lights turn on and off. My mom would find ways to debunk things so as to not scare us. The other major incident would be doors opening and closing, but it was always my bedroom door. From where my dad sat most nights playing TF2 well into the early morning hours, he could see my door. He would ask me in the morning if I happened to get up last night, and it was never me opening it. My mom had tried a few times to sage the house and cleanse it of evil spirits, but this honestly did nothing. Activity never slowed down or picked up, as if she had never tried it at all. In high school I decided to follow in the family's footsteps and start a career in fire/EMS. I took a high school course for EMT and graduated with my EMT cert. I joined a volunteer fire department shortly after graduating to get some experience with the hopes of going into a career eventually. About 3 years after high school, my Nana passed away. I was very close with her, and this was a sudden death. She had always been a big advocate for me pushing myself and achieving my dreams. I had landed a job at a large ambulance company and was eager to start. I had everything laid out the night before, like the first day of school, ready for my first day. At around 4 a.m. while I was asleep in my room, I remember waking up to my door opening and a short figure standing in the doorway, with no discernible features. As I stared at it, I wasn't scared or nervous and felt no malice. The door shut after 15 seconds or so, and I had just sat there for a bit processing everything. This was the first time I had personally seen the shadow figures my family was talking about. That morning I told my mom what happened, and she said that it wasn't her opening it. She suggested the thought that it could have been my Nana checking on me on my first day. She was about 5'2" on a good day, so in my head that added up with what I saw and went about life. Fast forward a few years. I'm now a firefighter paramedic in a career department, and I have proposed to my high school sweetheart. We just got our own apartment in a neighboring city and have our first pup, a wiener dog named Rocky. My fiancé was aware of some of the things that happened to me and my family growing up, but we had no idea that they were going to continue once I moved out. Our lives in this apartment consisted of me working my rotation of 24 hours on and 48 hours off, which is a pretty standard firefighter schedule, and Erica was going to school to become a dental hygienist. This apartment is when I began to start connecting some dots that maybe it wasn't just the house that had haunting issues. Small things would happen here, and it was never when my fiancé was home. The apartment was about 900 square feet, so if there was a noise, I would definitely hear it. The things I would experience here were lights turning on and off, but they wouldn't be in the room I am in. For instance, the bathroom would turn on, and I would be in the kitchen. The toilet would flush on its own, and we had motion sensor rope lights in our small walk-in closet in our bedroom that would turn on in the middle of the night. I remember feeling like someone was with me, but I never felt like it was harmful, just like I was in a crowded room in a sense. I remember hearing female whispers, but I would often chalk it up to being in an apartment, even though most of the place would be vacant during the day with my neighbors being at work. During this time I began to have very traumatic calls at work, the biggest event being one where 2 toddlers were hit head-on by a train, killing one on impact. This caused my mental health to decline, and there was a strong correlation with this and the activity that surrounded me. I began to go through therapy to help with coping with the work issues. Outside of these small events, nothing drastic happened in the short time we were at this apartment. We had set our sights on purchasing a home and starting a family. By this time Erica had graduated and begun working in her desired field, and I was as well. We had gone home shopping and found the perfect house for us in a neighboring city that was close to our jobs, family, and friends. Picking up from the apartment, we had moved into the new house, and everything was perfect. We had finally made it. 2 kids from the trailer park with successful lives and a beautiful home. Things with work, however, continued to be difficult. I would go on several calls that involved juvenile suicide, and working in healthcare during COVID was one of the most miserable and draining things I've ever done. My mental health was at an all-time low, and I was going to therapy on a weekly basis at this point. Through all this I never experienced anything at work, even though I spent so much time there. I feel like this was a catalyst for events that followed. Once I was at my lowest was when things escalated to new heights. One of the earliest signs something was still going on involved an artsy bathroom sign and a wall-mounted toilet paper holder. My wife had the sign positioned right over this holder, and in theory a normal household shouldn't have any issues. We heard a loud bang one day and went to that small bathroom and saw the sign on the floor. Thinking it was odd since no door was closed and no wind was coming through, we put it back up and shut the door. About 2 minutes later it fell again and landed directly on the holder. Then it hit me, holy duck, this thing is still here. It was still ducking with me. This proceeded to happen over and over again in the next several weeks at completely random times, each time striking the holder. It happened so much that it finally knocked the holder off the wall, and once it was removed, that sign hasn't moved in years since. Things began to happen more in the open and during the day. The first instance that was in front of my wife was in our side living room area, and my wife was cleaning the floors. We had a power surge in the kitchen, and her jacket flew off the back of a chair in the dining room, which is next to the kitchen. The table was directly between my wife and me, and we both saw this. Walking into the kitchen, and all the appliances had their times reset like a power surge, but nothing else in the house had any issues. This happened at around 10 a.m. She was very freaked out at this point, and it was then when I couldn't really continue to hide it. I had found various reasons to play things off and cover for excuses, but this was unexplainable. At this point I was still in monthly therapy sessions to deal with work-related issues. Mental health had improved quite a bit. Things seemed to come in waves as if it was building up strength and feeding on my weaknesses. Looking back, it felt like it would build up over several months and get progressively more constant and severe and then dissipate for random amounts of time. It would ramp up with events like 1 to 3 times a month, then once a week, then a few times a week, to daily. It would usually build up in severity and then back to nothing. I would be downstairs in our 2-story home gaming late at night and have lights turn on where I could see them. I would begin to jokingly talk into the open and say things like, "If you are going to turn lights on, you can pay some of the bill," trying to make light of what was happening. My wife had asked questions on the history of it, and I explained that since I was a young child, I had issues. She began to ask if we could look into getting rid of this thing. I always told her, unless it's causing harm, I'm not ducking with it. The absolute terror of the unknown was enough for me to just deal with it. I was a decent horror buff at this point, even though my daily life was basically one. When thinking about things escalating, I always thought of Paranormal Activity and the scene where they put down flour, and now you know the footsteps were goat hooves. You can't unsee that shit. I functioned heavily on the ignorance is bliss approach when it came to all this. Probably not the best approach, but it worked at the time. After this there was a lull of a few months. Just long enough to give you some hope that things might be going back to normal. At this point my wife and I began to start trying for a child. I know, the only thing to make this worse would be adding a kid, but here we go. We were having infertility issues, and this would go on for about 2 years total. Some of the things we experienced during this time are as follows. I apologize for the chronological order of these events, but it all becomes muddy after a bit. I told my wife goodnight and went to play some World of Warcraft in my office room. The door was open down the hallway initially, and as I walked closer, the door shut in my face. I proceeded to open it and sit down like it never happened. I truly tried my best to ignore it and move on. We both tried to function on the thought process of don't feed into it, and hopefully it will just go away. My wife experienced things being thrown 2 different times. To preface, she almost never saw things, or it would only happen when I was home, so for her to see something was significant. The first one was downstairs in our living room while I was upstairs gaming. I had a t-shirt on a coffee table, and it was tossed across the room while she was sitting on the couch. The second was when she was showering. She had our JBL speaker blasting Cardi B, and it was thrown off of the bathroom counter onto the floor. I was also home for this one. These were some of the bigger events. Woven in were the constant footsteps and light switches turned on. It also figured out how to turn on the TV and PS5 downstairs. We would wake in the morning, and the TV or PlayStation would just be on and idling. Channels never would change, and nothing would move on the screen, though. I finally got the dumb idea to try and record the downstairs activity while we slept. I bought 2 motion sensor cameras and had them set up near areas where things would often happen. When I had cameras recording, not a thing would happen. When I turned them off, naturally, that would be the time when things would go bump downstairs. This, along with other examples, leads me to believe this was as intelligent of a haunting as you can get. Things again dissipated and picked back up like clockwork. This next experience was worse than it had been before. The 3 big notable ones that I will mention are as follows. Again, I apologize for the correct order of events. The first one will be about my dogs. At this point we now have 2 wiener dogs named Rocky and Sully. I wanted bigger dogs, and she wanted smaller, so we compromised and got 2 smaller dogs. My wife went to work out, and I was upstairs folding laundry. It was around 10:30 to 11 a.m. She had been gone for about 15 minutes at this point, and my dogs were upstairs running around playing. I then heard in my wife's voice, clear as day, say, "Boys, stop barking, it's just Mama," and they stop in their tracks. I was so confused because I was 100% sure she wasn't home. I called her real quick to see if she stopped back in cause she forgot something, and she told me she had just pulled up to the gym. I left my room to go investigate and found nothing. That was the only instance of things for the day. The next one I can recall was another midday experience where I was home alone. It was around noon, and I had just come downstairs for lunch. We had just recently had our anniversary, and there was a balloon in the house. The balloon had originally been in the dining room, and the exits of that room have an approx 1-foot lip for the doorway to go to the next room. The balloon had left the room and was actively floating in front of me in the kitchen, slowly bobbing up and down, and made its way to the back living room. For it to be able to leave the initial dining room, it had to be physically moved. It wouldn't have any way to duck into the doorway. I just stood there watching this in disbelief. At this point I had dealt with enough and decided to retaliate. I grabbed a knife from the butcher block and popped the balloon. Put the knife back, made some lunch, and went upstairs. I had one of the dogs in my lap watching some Twitch stream on my PC when I felt a burning sensation on my leg. This was maybe 15 minutes later. I was wearing long jogger-style pants and pulled them down to see what that was, and I saw 3 long scratch marks about 1 inch apart on my thigh. This was the point that scared the absolute duck out of me. After that I had just turned to the open room and apologized and said that we were even and I would like to continue to try and live in harmony. Nothing else happened that day. The final experience in this stretch was a little more convoluted. At work I had been going through a rough patch with very traumatic calls. I would tend to have very vivid night terrors after these. This batch had consisted of a few cases of juvenile suicides and another person versus train. This specific dream was different, though. I was in my own home, and heavy footsteps were sprinting for me. I was screaming my wife's name for help and banging on walls, but no noise was coming out. I felt as if my mouth was being held shut and I was using my hands to pry my mouth free. I had actually awoken and was screaming my wife's name when I woke up, which ducked the both of us up. This was the peak of the activity for this stretch. After this, things died down for about a year. I had been talking with my therapist about the paranormal activity I was dealing with, as it was a big factor in my mental health. Dealing with death at work all day and then coming home, where I was supposed to be able to unwind and relax, was almost worse than working most days. We had discussed the possibility of what this could be and came up with a poltergeist style of haunting, which fit the description from what I could find. It basically is described as a malignant haunting that can interact with objects and feeds off of bad energy. Which added up with all the depression I had been going through with work and the infertility issues we had, up to experiencing a miscarriage. At this point we were able to have a happy, healthy baby girl in December of 2022. I don't really recall much going on at this point. I would say about 6 months into her being around was when things started to pick back up again, slowly as they had. Lights going on and off, footsteps, door handles jiggling to rooms we are in, the go-tos of the haunting. We had lightly discussed the issues of having our daughter be in the same environment as this entity. Ever since the balloon incident, nothing violent or malicious had occurred, but I always had an uneasy feeling and never felt alone. Around her first birthday, things began to pick up and were back to a daily occurrence. I had tried to keep most of these to myself so as to not spook my wife. I figured if it was just me dealing with it, I could just bear the burden and move on to keep the peace of everything in the household. For the first time in the history of this, I was at work on my 24th, and she was hearing things while I was away. She was putting our daughter down for bed and was hearing footsteps outside of her room and could see a shadow walking past the doorway. I remember her texting me as it was actively happening, saying she was done with this. Honestly, I couldn't blame her, I was at my end with it too. But going back to the whole question of what the duck do you do? That fear of the unknown paralyzed me. What happens if we do something and it doesn't work? The house isn't haunted, my wife isn't haunted, it's me. It's followed me from 4 different houses in 4 different cities, and it has no signs of stopping. I had begun doing some research into what the duck I needed to do. I began even asking coworkers if they had anything like this, and they thought I was batshit crazy, not that I blamed them. My lieutenant kept asking if I had any photo or video proof, and I told him I tried once, but never again. Once I knew what was in there it would have been game over. For Christmas, my wife bought me an LED gamertag sign that would light up bright red. It actually came from overseas, so I had to order an American outlet adapter from Amazon for it. Once it showed up, I plugged that bad boy in, and it was beautiful. For the time being, I had it sitting on the floor in our computer room. This specific night I had told my wife goodnight and went to go game it up for a bit. Turned on the PC and shut the door and went downstairs to get some G Fuel and snacks. As I was walking up the stairs, I could see a red glow from underneath the door. The neon sign had been turned on while I was out of the room. I immediately unplugged it and went about my night. Before I left, I plugged it back in and turned the remote upside down on the table. This was my own little ducked up experiment to see if it was moving the remote and turning it on or not. In hindsight this was dumb, but here we are. That morning when I woke up, it was on. I had it, then unplugged it again and went to work. A few days had gone by with nothing. I started to use that LED sign as a ghost gauge basically. One night while I was at work, I got a text from my wife asking if I had left the sign on. I believe I lied and told her yes for ease of mind, but I knew damn well I didn't. After this there was a stretch of a few nights when my wife would work long hours and I was at home with our daughter. During these days I would hear footsteps upstairs while we were downstairs, and I began to smell perfume. It was the same perfume my Nana would wear, and I haven't smelled it since she passed away many years ago. I had also begun to hear a male voice with whispers of incoherent speech, but it sounded distant. Over these few days, the whispering got louder and louder to the point where it was undeniable I was hearing whispering, but it was gibberish. Nothing made sense when I heard it. Most noticeably would be when I was putting our daughter to bed and I was lying on the floor of her dark room till she dozed off. I would just hear it constantly. Not knowing if it was just my nerves being absolutely ducking shot or if it was real at this point. I didn't tell my wife about this because yet again I felt that I should be the one to just bear the burden, but this was my breaking point. For context, it's the beginning of February at this point. Out of a shot of desperation, I tracked down my pastor from my church growing up. My kid was at my parents' house for the day while I caught up on some yard work. I drove down to a local gas station so I didn't have the conversation in the home. We limited as much recognition of the entity in the home as much as possible, and this was my way of escaping to call for help. I remember calling him and asking if he had some time to speak. He did remember me from when I would go as a kid, and I told him I felt that I had something paranormal going on in my life and asked if he could listen and hopefully help. He was a little taken aback but obliged and let me tell my entire story as I just have here. He had said, "Well, knowing you and the profession you're in, I'm leaning towards the fact that this is real and you aren't having a psychiatric issue." He offered to come out a few days later. He told me that he was going to contact a specific group of people he knew in the Catholic Church whose job was to deal with exorcisms and get some advice on how to approach this. He gave me the confidence that we would solve it, and I began to cry. I had mixed emotions of terror and joy, hoping this would be the end but having no clue how it would go. I spoke with my wife about the ordeal, and the pastor was going to come help us. He asked that we all be present in the house during this ceremony. Once he showed up to the house, he greeted us with a smile and said he was going to bless the house and us inside of it. We walked with him to each room as he was saying prayers and tossing holy water throughout. The entire time I was waiting for the absolute worst to occur. Every horror movie you see at this point goes to absolute shit and someone dies. Once he had walked through the house and blessed each room, we went to the living room and locked hands and prayed. This process took about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm honestly not the biggest religious guy around and mainly went to church because of family, but I was all in on this because we had no other choice. Father Doug then gave me the number to what I can describe as the Exorcist hotline. He said if things persist or get worse, call that number immediately. It has been about 6 months now at the time of writing this as I lay in my bed at work, and things have stopped completely since that day. This is all 100% true, and I 100% have zero proof of this writing besides the accounts of my family and myself. Some people are skeptical of ghost stories. I'm just glad mine is over for now. I was inspired to put this down on paper so as to not forget it and have this chapter of my life logged. Thank you for your time.